Imagine sitting beside a quiet river, the wind soft, the world still. That's what Zen feels like. In the middle of chaos, Zen stories and Buddhist teachings offer calm not by changing the world, but by changing how we see it. This collection of timeless stories opens a door to that calm. With each tale, you'll step closer to inner balance, peace of mind, and the gentle strength that lives inside you. Let these hours be a quiet path back to yourself. The one-eyed turtle and the floating log. Long ago, the Buddha shared a powerful teaching through the image of a one-eyed turtle living deep in the ocean. He told his disciples that the chances of being born as a human, someone with the ability to learn, grow, and understand the Dharma are as rare as that turtle rising to the surface once every 100 years and placing its single eye through the hole of a floating log drifting across the sea. The story begins with the Buddha seated beneath the shade of a Bodhi tree, surrounded by monks who were beginning to take their human lives for granted. They felt they had time, always more time. But the Buddha, in his deep compassion, offered this image to awaken their hearts. Imagine, he said softly, a blind turtle swimming in the vast ocean. It surfaces just once every 100 years. Now imagine a wooden log, hollowed with a tiny hole, floating randomly on the water's surface. What are the chances that turtle, rising blind, and only once in a century, places its head through that hole? The monks were silent. The Buddha looked at them with gentle eyes and continued, "Even rarer than that is the chance to be born as a human being, and rarer still is the chance to hear the Dharma, to walk the path, and to awaken the mind." In the quiet after his words, a young monk wept. He had been careless with his practice, believing he could always begin tomorrow. But this story, simple and strange, struck something deep within him. He saw that life was a gift not guaranteed, not ordinary, and never to be wasted. Many who heard the Buddha's teaching that day began to see the world differently. The rising sun, the breath in their chest, the stillness of meditation all became sacred. They no longer waited to be ready. They chose to begin now. Moral of the story: being born as a human is a rare and precious opportunity. We may forget how sacred this life is, caught in daily worries or future plans. But like the one-eyed turtle and the drifting log, our existence is not by chance, it is a fleeting miracle. Every moment is a chance to awaken, to love, to learn. Let us not waste the gift we've been given. The next story is called "When the Rain Became the Master." It was the middle of the monsoon season at a quiet Zen temple nestled deep in the forest. Heavy rain fell without pause, drenching the earth, flooding the paths, and keeping the monks inside for days. One young monk grew restless. He paced the wooden floors, sighed often, and stared out the window in frustration. His meditation was scattered, his thoughts noisy. The endless sound of rain only made his discomfort worse. Seeing his struggle, the old Zen master sat beside him in silence. After a long pause, the master whispered, "Today, the rain is your teacher." The young monk was confused. "But master, the rain distracts me. I can't focus. It's loud and endless. I feel trapped." The master smiled gently. "It is only the rain that falls. The storm is in your mind." That night, unable to sleep, the young monk sat by the temple window and simply listened. He tried not to judge or resist the rain he just observed. The longer he sat, the more he noticed. The rain was not one sound, but many. Soft drops on leaves, heavier ones on stone, the slow rhythm on the roof. It wasn't noise. It was life speaking in its own language. As he listened more deeply, the monk began to feel a strange stillness inside. His breath slowed, his body relaxed. There was no storm left in him, only the rain, falling just as it was meant to. For the first time in days, his mind became quiet. At dawn, the master passed by and saw the young monk still sitting, peaceful and wide-eyed. "You see," said the master, "when you stop trying to control the world, even the rain becomes your teacher." From then on, whenever life felt overwhelming or loud, the monk would remember that night, not to run from discomfort, but to listen to it, to let it teach, to let it be. Moral of the story: peace does not come from silence outside, but stillness within. When we stop resisting what we feel, even the noise becomes a path to understanding. Sometimes, the very thing we fight against, pain, chaos, fear, can become our greatest teacher. The rain doesn't disturb us. Our resistance does. When we accept the moment fully, every drop becomes a lesson in calm. The next story is called Hakuin's Inkpot Dream. Hakuin Ekaku, the great Zen master of Japan, was known for his fiery spirit and deep wisdom. He taught not only with words, but through stories, silence, and sudden moments that shook students awake. Yet few know of the dream that once changed Hakuin himself, a vision so strange, so vivid, it brought tears to his eyes when he awoke. It was a cold winter night, and Hakuin had spent the evening writing calligraphy by lamplight. He had been preparing scrolls for his students, each stroke careful and steady. By his side sat a small black ink pot, worn, cracked, but still full. He dipped his brush in, wrote a final phrase about emptiness, and then rested. That night, in the silence of sleep, he dreamed. In the dream, he was again seated at his desk. But the room was different, endless, open like a vast field, and lit not by lamp, but by moonlight pouring through invisible walls. His inkpot sat before him, and when he reached for it, it suddenly grew large, expanding until it filled the entire space. From its mouth poured an endless stream of ink, not black, but deep blue like the ocean. The ink spilled across the dream world, forming mountains, rivers, trees, people, even stars. Hakuin stood in awe as everything he had ever known or loved flowed from that little pot. All creation had come from it. Every joy, every sorrow, every teacher, every student, even he himself. Then, just as suddenly, the ink began to vanish, pulled back into the pot. The mountains dissolved, the rivers ran dry, the people faded, and finally, Hakuin watched himself being drawn back in his body, breath, and thoughts. All was gone. Only the inkpot remained. When Hakuin awoke, tears were streaming down his face. He looked to his side. The inkpot was still there, quiet, unremarkable. But now, he bowed to it with deep reverence. He later told a student, "Everything comes from the same source, and everything returns to it. But the source itself cannot be grasped, only honored." Moral of the story: all things, thoughts, emotions, joys, and sufferings rise from the same invisible source and return to it. Life flows out of the unknown like ink from a pot. When we stop clinging to forms, we begin to understand their essence. Like Hakuin's dream, we learn the source is not something we can control or own. It is something we must bow to, live with, and trust. The next story is called The Bowl That Shattered Time. In a quiet monastery atop a misty mountain in ancient China, there lived an elderly Zen master known for his deep stillness. He had only one possession he truly cared for: a simple clay bowl. It was old, unremarkable in appearance, and had a small crack down its side. Yet the master used it every day for rice, for tea, even for reflection. The monks often wondered why he cherished such a flawed object. One day, a new novice arrived at the temple. Eager to learn, the boy often rushed through tasks and sought quick answers. One morning, while preparing breakfast, the novice accidentally knocked the old bowl from a shelf. It shattered on the stone floor with a sound that echoed through the temple halls. The master came quietly to the scene. The novice, trembling, bowed deeply. "Master, I am so sorry. I broke your bowl. I didn't mean to." But the old man only looked at the shards. Then he smiled, a soft, sorrowful smile that held no anger. He knelt beside the pieces and sat still for a long time. At last, he spoke. "This bowl has held my meals for 40 years. It has seen me in silence, in hunger, in joy. It was there when I was young, and still here as I've grown old, but now it is gone." The novice, confused, asked, "Aren't you sad?" The master nodded. "I am, but sadness is not a problem. Attachment is. You see, time was inside this bowl. Not clock time, but my memories, my habits, my sense of self. When it broke, a part of me did too. That is why I sit here, not for the bowl, but for what I see in its breaking." The boy sat beside him, silent. The master continued, "Everything we touch will one day fall apart. The ones we love, the bodies we live in, the ideas we hold on to. If we cannot learn to bow to impermanence, we will suffer endlessly. But if we let go gently, we may find something deeper than time." Moral of the story: we carry time inside the things we hold. Dear objects, routines, people, even identities. When they break or change, it hurts. But the pain shows us where we were clinging. Life is always moving. Nothing stays. When we learn to let go without bitterness, we don't lose ourselves. We return to what's real. The bowl shattered, but in that moment, something timeless was revealed. The next story is called Lingyun's Blossoming Moment. In ancient China, there was a young monk named Lingyun who struggled deeply with his practice. No matter how many scriptures he studied or how long he meditated, peace never came. His mind raced with questions. His heart ached for understanding. Every morning he swept the temple courtyard with care, but inside he felt empty. Years passed. His teachers encouraged him, but nothing seemed to awaken him. Eventually, he began to lose hope. One spring day, weary and uncertain, Lingyun was sent to collect water from the well outside the monastery. The air was soft, the world quiet. As he walked the stone path, he passed a wild mountain tree. It had bloomed overnight, sudden and radiant. Pink blossoms covered every branch, swaying gently in the breeze. Lingyun stopped. His breath caught. In that single moment, something in him cracked open. The world no longer seemed separate from him. There were no thoughts, no effort, no struggle. Just the blossom, just the wind, just the stillness that had always been waiting beneath everything. He dropped the water bucket. Tears welled in his eyes, not from sorrow, but from seeing clearly, for the first time, what had always been there. He returned to the temple without a word, bowed deeply before his teacher, and said, 30 years I searched for the truth. I chopped wood, carried water, recited sutras, and still I missed it. But today the blossoms showed me." The teacher smiled. "Then today you were ready to see." Lingyun later wrote a verse that became famous in Zen tradition. "For 30 years I searched for a sword. Now, seeing the peach blossoms, I have found it at last. No doctrine, no ritual, just the simple awakening that came not from effort, but from stopping, from seeing fully, from being present to the life that was unfolding all along." Moral of the story: enlightenment doesn't always come in silence or scriptures. It can arrive in a single moment of pure presence. When the mind becomes quiet, even the sight of a blossom can reveal the truth. We spend years searching outside ourselves, yet sometimes the deepest answers wait in the ordinary things we overlook. When we stop striving, beauty enters and with it, a wisdom beyond words. The next story is called The Monk Who Watched Ants for 10 Years. In a remote corner of a monastery deep in the mountains of Thailand, there lived a monk who seemed different from the rest. While others were busy chanting, sweeping, or meditating in the hall, this monk spent hours each day sitting quietly near an old tree, eyes fixed on the ground. At first, no one paid him much attention. But as weeks turned into months and months into years, the other monks began to whisper he had been watching ants. 10 years passed. Still, every day, at the same hour, he would walk barefoot to the tree, sit on a worn stone, and observe the tiny trail of ants moving back and forth. Some thought he had gone mad. Others mocked him quietly. Even the abbot, a kind but practical man, grew concerned. One afternoon, during the rainy season, the abbot approached him. "You've been watching these ants for a long time," he said gently. "Don't you think it's time to do something more useful?" The monk turned to him, eyes calm and clear. "I have done nothing but watch," he replied. "And in that, I have seen everything." The abbot sat beside him, curious. The monk pointed to the ground. "At first, I only saw ants busy, tiny, meaningless. But then I noticed how they never stray far from the path, how they pause when another passes, how they carry burdens many times their size, yet never complain. Some die, and others carry them gently aside. There is no rush, no pride, no despair, only the path and the walking." He continued, voice soft but steady. "I watched their seasons change, how they rebuild after storms, how they disappear in winter and return in spring. 10 years passed like one breath. And in that time, I learned patience, purpose, humility. I learned how to live." The abbot bowed deeply. From then on, the monk was no longer seen as strange. Others began to join him by the tree, at first out of curiosity, but soon in quiet reverence. They too began to see that even the smallest life holds deep teachings, if only we are still enough to notice. Moral of the story: wisdom does not always come in loud moments or sacred texts. Sometimes it lives in the smallest things, the unnoticed, the ordinary. The world speaks in quiet ways, but we are often too hurried to hear it. By slowing down and observing without judgment, we begin to see that every life, even the life of an ant, reflects the truth of existence: persistence, service, humility, and peace. The next story is called A Robe Full of Wind. In a remote Zen temple near the edge of the mountains, a young monk struggled with pride. He was brilliant, disciplined, and praised often by others. His robes were always perfectly folded, his posture flawless, and his chanting clear and strong. Yet inside, his heart was restless. Though he said the right words and followed every form, something felt missing, an emptiness he couldn't explain. One evening, a wandering monk arrived at the temple. His robe was tattered, his sandals worn, and his face weathered by wind and time. He bowed deeply to the abbot and asked for shelter. Though the younger monk looked at him with doubt, the abbot welcomed him in. That night, as the monks gathered for zazen, the wind howled outside the temple walls. The fire crackled low, and the hall grew cold. The young monk noticed the ragged traveler sitting quietly, wrapped in his thin robe, perfectly still despite the chill. After the sitting ended, curiosity stirred in the young monk. He approached the visitor. "How do you sit so still in the cold?" he asked, pulling his thick robe tighter. The old monk looked at him and smiled. "Because my robe is full of wind." The younger monk frowned. "Isn't that a bad thing?" "No," the old man said softly. "It means I do not push it away. The cold is here, the wind is here. I let them pass through me. I do not tighten, I do not resist. That is why I am warm." That night, the young monk couldn't sleep. He sat in the meditation hall alone, the wind creeping through the cracks. At first, he shivered. But then he remembered the old monk's words and loosened his grip. He stopped trying to fight the cold. Slowly, the fear, the pride, and even the idea of being a good monk began to melt. What remained was simple: breath, body, presence. And in that surrender, something opened. The next morning, as the sun rose, he saw the old monk walking down the mountain path. His robe fluttered in the wind like a flag, full of space. Moral of the story: True strength is not in holding tight, but in letting go. We often build thick robes of pride, fear, and control, thinking they'll protect us. But real warmth comes when we stop resisting life's winds. Peace is not the absence of discomfort, it's the willingness to feel it fully and still remain open. Like a robe full of wind, the heart becomes light when it no longer tries to hold anything back. The next story is called When Dogen Listened to Boiling Rice. In the early days of his return from China, the great Zen master Dogen was once invited to a monastery nestled in the quiet hills of Kyoto. The monks there had heard of his deep insight and welcomed him with reverence. But instead of giving a lecture or leading a ceremony, Dogen quietly asked if he could visit the monastery kitchen. Surprised, the head monk led him to the kitchen, where a humble cook was preparing rice for the midday meal. The fire was hot, and a large pot sat over it, bubbling and steaming. The cook, an old monk with wrinkled hands and a gentle smile, stirred the pot slowly, his eyes watching the grains as if they were sacred treasures. Dogen sat nearby, saying nothing. For over an hour, he simply watched the steam rise, watched the monk stir, watched the rice swell, soften, and release its scent into the air. The fire crackled, the water hissed. Nothing else was happening, yet everything was happening. At last, Dogen spoke. "Do you not find this work tiring?" The old monk laughed softly. "Only if the mind is somewhere else." Dogen nodded, then asked, "What do you think about while stirring the rice?" The monk smiled again. "Nothing. I stir the rice as if I was stirring the Dharma itself. Each grain is a teaching, each bubble a breath. If I let my mind wander, I burn both." Something in those words struck Dogen like a bell in the heart. He had studied scriptures, debated philosophy, meditated for years. Yet here, in the simple act of boiling rice, was the living truth of Zen: full attention, full presence, no separation between ordinary work and spiritual practice. Later, Dogen wrote in his teachings that even cooking rice is an expression of enlightenment. He urged his students to treat every task, no matter how small, as a sacred opportunity to awaken. To walk, to clean, to breathe, all could become the way, if done with full mind and open heart. Moral of the story: true practice isn't found only on mountain tops or in deep meditation. It lives in the most ordinary acts when done with presence, care, and devotion. Boiling rice, sweeping floors, walking through a garden each can become a gateway to awakening. When the mind stops searching and starts listening, even the sound of rice boiling can become the voice of wisdom. The next story is called The Koan Hidden in a Cricket Song. At a small temple surrounded by fields and tall grass, a novice monk named Jun struggled with the meaning of koans. These mysterious Zen riddles, meant to awaken the mind, left him confused and restless. He would sit for hours repeating, "What is the sound of one hand clapping?" or "Who were you before your parents were born?" But no answer came. Only frustration, only silence. One summer evening, as the sun dipped low and the world turned gold, Jun approached his teacher beneath a tree. "Master," he said, "I don't understand. I meditate on these koans every day, but they only fill my head with more questions." The old master didn't reply. He simply pointed toward the fields and said, "Tonight, go sit by the grass. Do not return until you hear the answer you seek." Though puzzled, Jun bowed and obeyed. He walked out to the edge of the field and sat cross-legged among the wild grasses. The air was warm, the sky darkened. Slowly, night settled around him. At first, all he noticed were his thoughts loud, spinning, impatient. But then, something else: the chirp of a cricket. It was soft, simple, repeating. He focused on it. The song was not special. It did not explain the meaning of life. It didn't solve the koan. And yet, as he listened, his mind began to quiet, not because he found an answer, but because he no longer needed one. There was only this moment. The cool air, the pulse of the earth, the sound of a cricket simply being what it was. Suddenly, Jun felt something shift inside him. His chest loosened. His breath deepened. He wasn't trying anymore. He was just here. By dawn, he returned to the temple. His teacher looked at him and asked, "Did the cricket speak?" Jun bowed deeply. "Yes, it said nothing and everything." The master smiled. "Then the koan has done its work." Moral of the story: enlightenment doesn't always come as a thunderclap. Sometimes it's the sound of a cricket in the dark, gentle, constant, unnoticed. We search for answers with effort, but the moment we let go, the mind opens. True wisdom is not found in solving the koan, but in becoming quiet enough to hear the silence it points to. The next story is called The Bell That Rang Without Sound. In an ancient Zen temple hidden among tall cedar trees, there hung a bell unlike any other. It was carved from dark metal, smooth and beautiful, but strangely, it had no clapper inside. It had never been struck, and no one had ever heard it ring. Still, the monks treated it with great respect. Every morning, before sunrise, they would bow to it in silence. A new novice, curious and full of questions, finally asked the old abbot, "Why do we bow to a bell that makes no sound?" The abbot, with kind eyes, replied, "Because it teaches the deepest truth." The boy was puzzled. But how can something that does nothing say anything? Instead of answering, the abbot invited him to sit in meditation by the bell each morning for 30 days. "Watch it," he said. "Listen. Don't try to hear it, just be with it." And so the young monk sat. At first, it was frustrating. He heard birds, footsteps, wind, everything but the bell. Some mornings he was restless, other days he was bored. Yet he kept returning, kept sitting, kept watching. On the 12th morning, something shifted. He noticed how the morning light reflected off the bell's surface, how the dust on it changed shape with the breath of wind, how the silence around it felt thick, alive, almost speaking. He began to feel that the bell was not empty, was full of stillness, full of meaning that could not be spoken. By the 25th day, he stopped waiting to hear anything. He no longer wanted sound. The silence of the bell had become enough. It was a kind of ringing that went beyond the ears felt, not as noise, but as presence. A soundless sound, a truth that did not need words. On the 30th day, the abbot asked him, "Did the bell ever speak to you?" The novice bowed deeply. "Yes, master," he whispered, "and it said everything." Moral of the story: not all truth comes through words or sound. Some of the deepest teachings arise from silence if we are patient enough to hear them. In a world that rushes to speak, to explain, to be loud, silence becomes sacred. The bell that rings without sound teaches us that stillness can speak louder than noise, and the heart can understand what the ears cannot. The next story is called Bodhidharma's Eyelid Cave. High in the Shaolin Mountains, surrounded by stone and silence, there is a cave where legend says Bodhidharma once sat facing a wall for 9 years. He did not speak. He did not move. He simply meditated, day after day, season after season, as wind and snow passed over the world outside. But there is one part of his story that few dare to tell: the story of his eyelids. It is said that in the early years of his meditation, Bodhidharma struggled with exhaustion. Though his vow was firm, his body was still bound by human limits. One night, after long hours of sitting, his eyes began to close against his will. Sleep pulled at him like a tide, and he drifted into dreams. When he awoke, shame flooded him. He had promised not to move from his seat until he had pierced the illusion of mind. In a moment of fierce determination, he did something unthinkably, tore off his own eyelids and cast them to the ground. Where they fell, the story goes, the first tea plants sprouted. From that day on, monks used tea to stay awake in long meditation, carrying forward the strange, painful wisdom of Bodhidharma's act. But the story does not end with blood or sacrifice. As Bodhidharma sat, now without the protection of lids to close off the world, something deeper happened. Without barriers, he saw everything. The dance of dust in the sunlight, the stillness of stone, the rise and fall of thought like waves. He no longer tried to push away distraction or drowsiness, he simply watched it all. Eventually, even the watcher disappeared. There was no Bodhidharma, no wall, no time. Just presence, endless and quiet. The cave became not a prison, but a mirror. Many years later, when he finally rose and left the cave, those who met him said his eyes held something unshakable, something vast, as if he had seen into the heart of all things and found no fear there. Moral of the story: discipline is not about punishment, it's about devotion. We often close our eyes to what's uncomfortable, distracting, or painful. But when we stay awake, even when it hurts, we begin to see the truth beneath illusion. Sometimes, awakening asks everything of us. And in the darkness of a cave, through pain and stillness, a deeper light is born. The next story is called The Zen of Stumbling on a Root. One quiet autumn morning, a young monk was walking alone through a forest trail behind the temple. The path was lined with trees that had begun to shed their leaves, carpeting the earth in shades of gold and rust. He walked with purpose, his mind full of thoughts about a koan his teacher had given him he could not solve no matter how hard he tried. As he moved through the woods, his steps grew faster, matching the pace of his thoughts. "What is the sound of one hand clapping?" he repeated over and over in his mind, frustration tightening in his chest. He longed for enlightenment, clarity, freedom, but it felt just out of reach. Suddenly, his foot caught on a thick root hidden beneath the leaves. He stumbled forward, arms flailing, and fell hard to the ground. The air was knocked out of his chest. His palms scraped against the earth. For a moment, all he could do was lay there shocked, still breathless. And then something happened. He heard the rustling leaves as they settled. He noticed the scent of damp soil, sharp and earthy. A bird sang above him. A breeze touched his cheek. The world, in that moment, was impossibly alive yet perfectly still. He didn't move. He didn't think. The koan, the frustration, the striving, they were gone. He was not trying to understand anymore. He was just here. Hurt, yes, but clear, awake. He sat up slowly, laughing not because it was funny, but because it was real. The root had done what hours of meditation could not. It had stopped him, broken the cycle, brought him back to now. Later that day, he told his teacher what had happened. The teacher smiled. "Some monks meditate for years to fall into that moment. You were lucky enough to trip into it." Moral of the story: sometimes it is not discipline or effort that awakens us, but the unexpected stumble. Life will trip us through loss, mistakes, or pain. And in that falling, the mind stops grasping, and clarity can arise. The path to peace is not always smooth. But even the route that makes us fall can open the door to the present moment, where all answers wait quietly. The next story is called The Bridge That Grew Moss. In a quiet valley where mist clung to the hills and rivers ran like threads of silver, there was a stone bridge connecting two small villages. It was not grand or famous, just an old footbridge, weathered by time, used by farmers, travelers, and monks. Most walked across it without a second thought, except one monk named Senzan. Every morning, Senzan would stop at the bridge and bow. He would place his hands together, lower his head, and stand still for a few breaths before crossing. The villagers found it strange. "It's just a bridge," they would say. "Why bow to that?" Senzan never answered, only smiled. But his ritual never changed. Over time, the villagers noticed something else. The center of the bridge began to change. While the rest of the stone remained dry and cracked, the space where Senzan paused each day became soft with green moss. At first, it was barely visible, a faint whisper of life. But as years passed, the moss grew rich and thick, softening the stone beneath his feet. Even in winter, it stayed vibrant, as if warmed by his presence. One day, a young boy followed the monk and asked, "Why do you bow to a bridge?" Senzan looked down at the moss and said gently, "This bridge carries everyone, but no one notices. It asks for nothing, gives everything, and is forgotten. But I bow to remind myself. Everything that supports unseen or unseen is sacred." The boy looked at the moss, then at the monk, and said quietly, "Then I'll bow too." Years passed. The boy grew into a man. The monk grew old. When Senzan passed away, the village gathered in silence. They carried his ashes to the bridge and scattered them where the moss had grown. That patch of green never withered. And over time, more villagers began to pause, to breathe, to bow not just to the bridge, but to the small things that carried them through life. Moral of the story: we often rush across the bridges in our lives, people, places, routines, without seeing their quiet strength. Gratitude doesn't require grand gestures. It begins in stillness, in noticing what holds us up every day. When we bow to the ordinary, we awaken to the sacred hidden within it. Even stone, when touched with reverence, can begin to grow. The next story is called The Rooster Who Became a Zen Master. In a small village temple surrounded by rice fields and quiet hills, there lived a loud, proud rooster. He belonged to the head monk, who had rescued him as a chick. Every morning before dawn, the rooster would crow from the temple roof, his voice echoing through the valley, waking not only the monks, but the entire village. Some monks found him annoying. They grumbled that he disturbed their early meditation. Others joked that he believed himself to be the master of the temple, but the head monk never scolded the rooster. Instead, he simply smiled and said, "Even the loudest voice can speak truth." One morning, during a period of intense training, a young monk was deep in zazen sitting meditation, struggling with restlessness. His mind was racing, full of doubts and distractions. Just as the sky began to lighten, the rooster crowed loud, sharp, and piercing. The sound startled the young monk. But instead of annoyance, something unexpected happened. The crow cut through the noise in his mind. In that one sharp moment, everything stopped. No thoughts, no striving, just pure awareness, still and clear. His breath deepened, his body softened. The moment opened like a flower. He didn't know what had happened, but it felt like truth. Later that day, he went to the head monk and told him about the experience. "Master," he said, "I think I understood something not from silence, but from that rooster." The head monk nodded. "Ah," he said, "so now you see. The rooster does not teach with words. He teaches with presence, with timing, with truth." From that day on, the young monk no longer complained about the rooster. In fact, many began to sit outside at dawn, waiting not for silence, but for that single powerful crow. A reminder that awakening doesn't always come in quiet. Sometimes it comes loud, sudden, and right when we need it. The villagers began to say, half in jest, "That rooster must be a Zen master in disguise." Moral of the story: enlightenment does not always arrive gently. Sometimes it comes in sharp, unexpected ways through a sound, a word, a fall, a crow. The truth doesn't always whisper. Sometimes it shouts. What matters is not how the moment comes, but whether we are awake enough to hear it. Even a rooster can become a master when the heart is ready to listen. The next story is called Ryokan's Last Haiku, Left in the Snow. Ryokan was a wandering poet monk, known not for fame or power, but for his gentle spirit. He lived simply, wore tattered robes, and spent his days writing poems, playing with children, and watching the seasons pass. He asked for little, gave freely, and laughed often. Many called him a fool. Others called him enlightened. But Ryokan never claimed anything. He only lived with open hands and an open heart. In his final winter, he grew weak. Snow had fallen heavily that year, blanketing the mountains and villages in silence. The wind was sharp, and his tiny hut offered little shelter. Still, he refused to move to the warmer temple offered by his students. "The snow will teach me," he said. One morning, after a long snowfall, a friend brought him food. When he opened the door to Ryokan's hut, he found it empty. The monk was gone. His thin mat was covered with frost. His robes were folded neatly by the wall, and near the door, drawn with a stick in the untouched snow, was a single haiku. The snow falls, leaving no trace. Just this body. The man stood in silence. The snow whispered around him. Ryokan had written his final poem, not on paper, but on snow, knowing it would melt, disappear, and vanish like everything else. He left no ceremony, no last words spoken aloud. Only this fleeting verse, as soft and passing as his life. His students wept, not from sadness alone, but from awe. For in those 7 simple words, Ryokan had said everything. About impermanence, about letting go, about life's quiet end. He had become one with the snow, one with the stillness, one with the truth he had always lived. Even now, centuries later, his final haiku is remembered not because it was preserved, but because it was meant to vanish. Moral of the story: nothing lasts, not breath, not snow, not even the words we leave behind. But beauty does not need to endure to be real. When we live with simplicity and truth, even our passing becomes a poem. Ryokan's snow haiku teaches us that the most powerful moments in life are often the softest, and that letting go is sometimes the most beautiful act of all. The next story is called The Brushstroke That Vanished. In the heart of Kyoto, there lived an old Zen calligrapher known for his silent presence and gentle hands. His scrolls were praised far beyond the temple wall, simple phrases brushed with such clarity and peace that people claimed to feel stillness just by looking at them. But the master never cared for fame. He only cared for the brush, the ink, and the moment. One rainy afternoon, a young student sat beside him, eager to learn the art. He watched as the master dipped his brush into ink and prepared to write the character for emptiness. The master's hand moved with perfect ease, smooth, confident, alive. But just as the brush touched the paper, something strange happened. The master paused. His hand hovered in the air. The student leaned in. The brush lowered slightly, and then, with one gentle breath, the master pulled back and set the brush down. The paper remained untouched. Nothing had been written. The student was confused. "Master, why didn't you finish?" The old man smiled softly. "I did. But there's nothing on the paper," the student said. The master looked at him, eyes warm but firm. "Not all brushstrokes are meant to be seen. Some are only meant to be felt." The student fell silent. Later, while sweeping the temple steps, he kept thinking of that moment. The poised hand, the breath, the stillness. And somehow, he began to understand. That unpainted stroke had more power than any inked line. It carried the presence of everything that could have been and everything that didn't need to be. In the space where the stroke never landed, the student felt something deeper than form. It was freedom. It was choice. It was Zen. He would remember that paper all his life, not for what was written, but for what wasn't. Moral of the story: not everything needs to be completed to hold meaning. Sometimes the space we leave untouched carries more truth than what we try to fill. In a world driven by action, expression, and results, there is quiet power in restraint, in presence, in knowing when not to act. The brushstroke that vanishes reminds us that wholeness isn't always visible. It often lives in silence, in pause, in the beauty of what we choose to let go. The next story is called A Pebble in Buddha's Alms Bowl. One morning in the quiet town of Vaishali, the Buddha rose early and began his daily walk with his alms bowl in hand. The streets were still and cool, the sun just touching the tops of the trees. As he walked barefoot through the village, people bowed, offered rice, fruit, or a smile. He accepted all without judgment, without preference, simply and gratefully. That day, a small boy stood waiting with trembling hands. He had nothing to give. His family was poor. They had run out of food the night before. But the boy had found something just: a small, round pebble by the river. It was smooth, shaped like a drop of moonlight. It had felt special to him, even if it was just a stone. As the Buddha approached, the boy stepped forward, his heart pounding. He placed the pebble gently into the alms bowl. The monks nearby looked puzzled. A few whispered, unsure if the boy's offering meant anything. But the Buddha looked down at the pebble, then into the boy's eyes, and smiled with deep kindness. He bowed, and then, without a word, he walked on. Later, a disciple asked him, "Master, why did you accept a pebble? It cannot be eaten. It is not an offering in the proper way." The Buddha answered, "That pebble was given with a pure heart." In that moment, the boy gave everything he had, not out of pride, not for merit, but from love. A gift like that carries no weight, yet it fills the bowl completely. The monks fell silent. That night, as the Buddha meditated beneath the stars, the pebble still rested in his bowl, cool, silent, and full of meaning. Though it fed no body, it nourished the spirit. Moral of the story: the value of a gift lies not in its form, but in the heart that offers it. Even the smallest act of sincerity becomes vast when given with love. We often measure worth in gold, words, or results, but the Buddha teaches us to look deeper. Sometimes the whole universe fits inside a pebble if it is placed in a bowl with open hands and a pure heart. The next story is called The Novice Who Fed the Ghost. In a small hillside temple overlooking mist-covered fields, there lived a young novice named Kien. He was quiet, kind, and devoted, but also deeply afraid. Not of the dark or of storms, but of the stories whispered through the halls, of the ghost said to haunt the old stupa at the edge of the forest. The monks avoided the stupa, especially after dusk. They said the ghost was hungry, angry, and lonely. Offerings left there would vanish by morning, and sometimes strange cries echoed through the trees. Kien, though fearful, was also full of curiosity and compassion. One evening, just before sunset, he packed a small bowl of rice and quietly made his way through the trees toward the stupa. His hands trembled. The wind stirred the leaves. Shadows stretched long and thin. When he reached the ancient stone monument, he knelt and placed the rice at its base. "I don't know if you're real," he whispered, "but if you're hungry, please eat." Then he bowed and left. He returned the next night, and the next. Each time, he brought simple food: rice, sweet yam, tea, and each morning it was gone. Some monks said animals took it. Others warned him to stop. But Kien didn't stop. He wasn't feeding fear anymore. He was feeding something deeper, an offering not of rice, but of presence. On the seventh night, as he knelt again in the moonlight, something stirred in the trees behind him. He felt a presence, cold but not cruel, heavy but not hateful. He didn't look back. He simply placed his hands together and said, "I know you are suffering. I cannot change your past, but I can sit with you now." The wind grew still. In that silence, something softened. The presence faded, the weight lifted. Kien opened his eyes, and for the first time felt no fear-only peace. From that day forward, no more cries were heard in the forest, and the stupa, once shrouded in fear, became a place of calm. Moral of the story: compassion is stronger than fear. When we meet suffering not by fighting or running, but by feeding it with kindness, we begin to heal what frightens us. The ghost may not be real, or it may live inside us. Either way, when we offer presence instead of avoidance, even the darkest places can become sacred. The next story is called Zen Master in a Lotus Petal. Long ago, in a temple hidden beside a still lake, there lived a young monk named Kaido who had one question that burned endlessly in his heart. Where does the true master live? He believed that if he could find the perfect teacher, the one who held all the answers, he would finally understand the truth. He traveled far and wide, across mountains and oceans, seeking sages, debating monks, and sitting long hours in silence. But no one gave him the answer he longed for. Some teachers spoke in riddles. Others offered silence. A few smiled and said nothing at all. His longing only deepened. One day, weary and lost, Kaido stumbled upon a pond where lotus flowers bloomed in stillness. The sun warmed the petals, and the water held the sky's reflection. He sat beside the water, defeated and exhausted. He sighed aloud, "I've searched everywhere. Where is the master?" A soft breeze stirred the petals. Kaido leaned forward, staring into one perfect lotus. Its gentle folds curved inward like quiet hands. In that moment, a single drop of water rolled down one petal's edge and fell into the pond with the tiniest sound clip. He felt his breath stop. There was no voice, no flash of light, no words of wisdom. But he saw. The petal, the pond, the drop, his breath, his question, they were not separate. The lotus had never spoken, yet in its quiet unfolding, it revealed more than 1,000 sutras. Tears filled his eyes. It wasn't that the master had been hiding. It was that Kaido had been searching too hard to see what had always been in front of him. The master was not a person. The master was presence. The master was the now. From that day on, Kaido stayed by the pond, not because he gave up, but because he had arrived. Moral of the story: sometimes we search the world for what is already within us. The true master does not always come with robes or titles. It may be a breath, a flower, a single moment of stillness that meets us when we stop grasping. The lotus does not teach with words, it teaches by being. And in its silence, the deepest wisdom blooms. The next story is called The Candle Lit by Silence. In a remote Zen temple far from the noise of the world, there was a tradition held only once a year. On the coldest winter night, when snow blanketed the earth and the wind moved like a whisper through the pines, the monks would gather in the main hall and sit in complete silencino, chanting. No teaching, no movement. Just one candle, unlit, placed in the center of the room. The silence would begin at midnight and end at sunrise. No one explained the meaning of this ritual. It was passed down, quietly, without words. New monks were simply told, "Sit, be still. Do not speak, watch the candle." One year, a young monk named Arai joined the temple just days before the ritual. When the night came, he wrapped himself in his robe and entered the hall, uncertain. The air was cold, and the room dark except for the faint outline of the candle. He sat with the others, waiting. Hours passed. The silence was thick, almost heavy. He felt every breath, every shift in his body, every thought rise and fall like waves. Doubt crept in. Is something supposed to happen? He wondered. Is someone going to light the candle? But no one moved. His legs ached. His mind raced. Then, slowly, something began to change. He stopped fighting the silence. The room grew brighter, not from flame, but from awareness. In that stillness, our eye began to notice everything: the slow rhythm of breath, the warmth in his chest, the subtle movement of others, the snow pressing against the walls. The candle, though unlit, seemed to glow, its presence quiet, steady, alive. Tears welled in his eyes, though he didn't know why. The silence, once a burden, now felt like a blanket. He didn't want to speak. He didn't want the night to end. At dawn, a senior monk gently rose and bowed. The others followed. The ritual was over. The candle remained unlit. And yet, Arai would later write in his journal, "That night, something lit inside me, and it burned without flame, without smoke, only silence." Moral of the story: some lights do not need fire, some teachings do not need words. In stillness, the heart can awaken more brightly than in sound or ceremony. We often look for meaning in what is done or said, but sometimes the deepest truths arrive quietly, in silence. The candle that never burned taught the monks that true illumination begins within. The next story is called "The Tea That Was Never Poured." A proud scholar once climbed the long mountain path to visit a renowned Zen master. He had read hundreds of books on Buddhism, studied every sutra he could find, and even taught others about the Dharma. But still, something gnawed at him, a quiet sense that he was missing something. Hoping to complete his understanding, he came seeking the master's approval. When he reached the monastery, the master greeted him kindly and offered tea. The scholar bowed deeply. "Master," he said, "I have studied for many years. I understand the Four Noble Truths, the Eightfold Path, the nature of emptiness, and the illusion of self. I've read all the teachings of Nagarjuna and Dogen. Still, I feel something is missing." The master nodded, then picked up the teapot and 2 cups. He placed 1 cup before the scholar and began to pour. The tea filled the cup quickly, reaching the brim. But the master didn't stop. He kept pouring. The tea spilled over the edge, pooling on the floor, soaking the mat. "Master!" the scholar cried, startled. "The cup is full. No more can go in." The old master looked at him calmly and said, "Exactly." The room fell silent. The scholar's breath caught. For a long moment, he stared at the overflowing cup, and slowly, the meaning sank in. All his knowledge, all his ideas, beliefs, pride, and theory shad filled him up. There was no space left for something new, something real. He hadn't come to learn. He had come to be affirmed. The master put down the teapot and said gently, "If you truly want to understand, first empty your cup." The scholar bowed again, but this time not out of pride. His face softened. His eyes lowered. He saw that before the truth could enter, he had to let go of what he thought he already knew. Moral of the story: the mind that clings to knowledge can become just as closed as the mind that clings to ignorance. Wisdom doesn't pour into a full cup. When we empty ourselves of pride, assumption, and certainty, we make space for true understanding. Sometimes, the greatest teaching isn't in what is poured, but in what we're finally ready to receive. The next story is called "The Gate That Led Nowhere." In a forgotten corner of an old Zen monastery, hidden behind overgrown vines and tall grass, there stood a weathered wooden gate. It had no path leading to it, and beyond it lay only empty fields. No walls surrounded it, no fences marked its purpose. It simply stood silent, still, and strange. Young monks often whispered about it. "Why is there a gate with no road?" they asked. "What does it guard? Where does it lead?" But no one knew. The older monks offered no answers, only a faint smile when asked. One day, a curious novice named Toma could no longer resist. He rose before dawn and made his way to the gate. The morning mist clung to the earth. His sandals were wet with dew as he stood before the old wood. He reached out and pushed it open. It creaked softly, just enough to let in a breeze. Beyond the gate was exactly what he had seen before, nothing, just grass, trees, and a gentle hill in the distance. Frustrated, he went to the abbot and said, "Master, I opened the gate. It leads nowhere. Why is it there?" The abbot looked at him quietly and said, "Then sit there, stay with it, watch." So Toma returned. He sat beside the gate as the sun rose and fell. He came back the next day, and the next. At first, he waited for something miraculous to happen, a vision, a sign, a voice. But none came, just wind through leaves, birdsong, silence. But something strange began to shift. As he sat, the gate no longer seemed useless. It stood like a mirror framing the sky, the clouds, the changing light. The nothing it opened to was not empty. It was spacious, alive, gentle. One morning, a breeze passed through the gate and over his face, and he felt it in his chest as if the gate had opened something inside him too. Later, the abbot found him still there, smiling. "It led you somewhere, didn't it?" he asked. Toma bowed deeply. "Yes," he whispered. "Here." Moral of the story. Not all doors lead to destinations. Some are meant to open us to presence. We often seek purpose, movement, answers, but the gate that leads nowhere reminds us that stillness holds its own wisdom. When we stop asking where, we arrive, and in that quiet arrival, we find a kind of peace that paths can never promise. The next story is called When the Buddha Laughed at a Wall. One day in the city of Sravasti, the Buddha and his disciples were walking through a quiet village after their morning alms round. As they passed by an abandoned courtyard, a group of young monks noticed a crumbling brick wall leaning dangerously to one side. The wall was jagged, uneven, and broken in many places. Some bricks jutted out. Others had fallen completely. Ivy crept through its cracks like time reclaiming its shape. One disciple turned to the Buddha and said, "Master, how foolish the builder must have been. Look at that wall, so poorly made, so carelessly built." The Buddha stopped. He turned to face the wall, then smiled. And then, softly, he laughed. The monks looked at each other, confused. "Why do you laugh, Master?" another asked. The Buddha stepped closer to the wall, ran his fingers gently along one of the cracks, and said, "Because I see myself in this wall." Now the monks were truly puzzled. The Buddha sat down in the dust before the wall and spoke, not to them, but almost to the wind. "There was a time when I too was uneven. I too was built from confusion, from craving, from fear. My mind had missing pieces, my heart leaned with sorrow, yet the wall did not fall, and neither did I." He looked up at his students. "We laugh at what is crooked, we mock what is flawed, but this wall still stands through storms, through years, through silence. It does not ask to be perfect. It simply continues, and in that, there is deep strength." The disciples grew quiet. The wind passed softly between the wall's broken bricks. The Buddha rose and added, "We are all walls with cracks, but the light enters there." And then he walked on. Moral of the story. Flaws do not make something worthless, they make it real. In a world that praises perfection, we forget the quiet power of what is broken but still standing. The Buddha did not laugh in scorn, but in recognition. Because even in a leaning wall, there is truth. That imperfection is not failure. It is the place where wisdom, compassion, and light begin to grow. The next story is called The Sutra the Wind Wrote. In the mountains of northern India, where tall cedars whisper and rivers carve through stone, There once lived a quiet monk named Samita. He had no title, no students, no temple. He wandered alone, sleeping beneath trees and meditating beside streams. He carried no scriptures with him, not even a bowl or robe. When asked why, he would smile gently and say, "I read the wind." Many didn't understand him. How could the wind teach? How could air carry wisdom? But Samita believed that nature itself held the Dharma, and so every morning he sat beneath the same tree and listened not with his ears alone, but with his whole being. One autumn day, while the leaves turned gold and began to fall like slow rain, the wind rose gently. It moved through the branches, rustled the leaves, and danced across the surface of a small pond nearby. Samita sat still, watching as ripples spread and leaves spun in circles. Then something happened. A gust of wind tore through the clearing, lifting a single leaf from the ground. It rose, fluttered, and landed softly on Samita's lap. On its delicate surface, a thin trail of water had formed a perfect pattern, curving, bending, spiraling inward like an ancient script. He looked down at the leaf, breath held. It looked like writing, though no language he knew. But as he stared, he felt something move inside him. Not words, not knowledge, but understanding. He realized then that the wind had written a sutra, not in ink, but in motion, not for the eyes, but for the soul. A teaching with no sound, no letters, only presence. In that moment, he saw everything: impermanence in the falling leaves, interconnection in the ripples, compassion in the way the tree gave shelter to the wind. The world had spoken in its own voice, and he had finally heard it. Samita kept the leaf until it crumbled to dust, and then he let it go, just as the wind had taught him. Moral of the story: wisdom doesn't always come from books or teachers. It can come from wind, from water, from silence. The world is always speaking, always writing its own sutra across the surface of life. But we must learn to listen differently. When the mind becomes still, even the wind can whisper truth. And sometimes the deepest teachings are written on a leaf that no one else sees. The next story is called The Master Who Hid in a Tree for 30 Years. There was once a Zen master named Jinan who disappeared without warning. One day, he simply vanished from the monastery where he had taught for decades. His students searched mountains, valleys, and villages, but no trace of him remained. Some thought he had died. Others believed he had reached enlightenment and left the world behind. Years passed. His name became legenda whisper among monks, a ghost in the sutras. But Jinan had not left the world. He had gone into the forest. There, deep in a grove of ancient trees, he climbed into the hollow of an enormous cedar and made it his home. He ate only what the forest offered. He slept curled inside the tree's body, through summer heat and winter snow. He spoke to no one. He wrote no teachings. He listened to birds, wind, falling rain. His only meditation was stillness. His only companion was time. Decades later, a woodcutter wandering through the forest heard a faint cough above him. Startled, he looked up and saw, nestled among the leaves, an old man with wild hair and eyes like clear water. The woodcutter cried out, "Are you spirit or man?" The figure climbed slowly down, feet bare, robes in tatters, but with a face shining in a way the man couldn't explain. Jinan smiled and asked, "Has the Dharma changed in 30 years?" The woodcutter didn't understand. Jinan chuckled softly, "Neither do I." When news reached the monastery, the monks came running to see the teacher they had lost. They bowed, cried, begged him to return, but he only pointed to the trees. "I did not hide," he said. "I learned to stop speaking. I watched the seasons. I watched myself. At first I feared I was wasting time, but over the years I realized time was wasting me. And then it stopped, and I was only here." He turned to leave. A young monk called out, "Master, what should we tell those who still search for truth?" Jinen looked back and said, "Tell them to stop searching. Tell them to sit beneath a tree and wait." Moral of the story: truth is not found in movement, in books, or in fame. It ripens slowly, like a fruit under the sun, in silence and solitude. The world tells us to chase wisdom, but sometimes the greatest teachings come when we disappear into nature, into stillness, into ourselves. Jinen did not escape life. He entered it fully. And from a tree, he saw what running had always hidden, that the truth doesn't need to be found. It only needs to be heard. The next story is called The Sandal That Rang the Temple Bell. In a quiet temple nestled between bamboo groves and stone lanterns, there lived a humble monk named Hakujo. He was known for doing the smallest tasks with deep attentions, weeping leaves, carrying water, folding robes. He never gave sermons or answered big questions. He simply moved through each day like a breeze, unnoticed, yet calming. The temple had a great bronze bell, suspended from thick beams. It rang at dawn and dusk, its deep voice calling monks to meditation. But only the head priest was allowed to strike it, using a heavy wooden beam hung from ropes. One rainy evening, after meditation had ended, Hakujo walked across the stone courtyard to return a sandal left behind in the hall. The sandal was old, torn at the heel, and forgotten. As he crossed beneath the bell tower, he slipped. His foot caught on the stone step, and the sandal flew from his hand, landing with a soft thud against the side of the bell. And then, gong. The sound echoed through the night, slow, pure, and deep. Monks emerged from their quarters, confused. The bell was never struck at that hour. Had someone broken the rules? They found only Hakujo, kneeling beside the sandal, eyes closed, hands folded in apology. The head priest approached. "Did you strike the bell?" Hakujo bowed. "No, master. The bell was struck by a sandal." Some monks chuckled, others frowned, but the priest stood silent, listening not to the explanation, but to the lingering vibration still humming through the air. After a moment he said softly, "Then the Dharma has spoken through the sandal." From that day on, the story of Hakujo's accident became part of the temple's quiet lore, not as a lesson in clumsiness, but in mindfulness. Because that accidental strike reminded them all, the bell does not care what strikes it. It only echoes what is true. Moral of the story: sometimes awakening comes not from effort, but from accident. The sacred does not always arrive with ceremony or control. It can come from a falling sandal, a misstep, a simple moment that touches something deep. Life rings like a bell when we stop trying to strike it perfectly and simply let it sound. The next story is called Zen Between Snowflakes. One winter morning, a young monk named Takuan stood outside the temple, broom in hand. Snow had fallen all night, blanketing the courtyard in silence. The world seemed paused, soft, white, still. Takuan began to sweep, but with each stroke of the broom, fresh flakes landed where he had just cleared. No matter how hard he worked, the snow kept falling. It felt endless. Frustrated, he paused and looked up at the sky, his breath visible in the cold air. An old Zen master appeared behind him, watching quietly. "Master," Takuan said, "I sweep, and the snow returns. I try to make it clean, but it never stays. What's the point?" The old man stepped forward and took the broom from his hands. Instead of sweeping, he stood still. A single snowflake landed on his shoulder, then another and another. He smiled and said, "Can you hear it?" "Hear what?" Takuan asked. "The snow," the master whispered. "Not falling, just being." Takuan listened. There was no sound, only the faint hush of the world breathing. The flakes drifted without purpose, without rush, each one different, each one complete. The master continued, You try to clear the snow as if the ground must always be seen. But Zen is not in the clearing. It's in the falling. It's in the moment before a snowflake touches the earth. The space between. Takuan's eyes widened. He looked again not with frustration, but with stillness. He saw the way the snow moved, not as a storm, but as a dance. He saw how even his own breath joined the scene, vanishing into the cold like smoke. And for the first time, he felt no need to do anything, just to be. They stood in silence together as snow fell gently all around. Moral of the story: peace doesn't always come from action, it often lives in stillness. We try so hard to fix, clear, and control, believing that life must be managed. But true Zen is found in the quiet spaces between what happens, like the pause before a snowflake lands. When we stop chasing stillness and simply notice the moment, we find that calm has been with us all along, drifting down softly from the sky. The next story is called The Dog Who Barked at Emptiness. In a small Zen temple on the edge of a mountain village, there lived an old monk named Genjo, who tended the grounds and watched over a stray dog that had wandered in one winter and never left. The dog had no name, but was loved by all. It followed the monks during walking meditation, curled beside them during zazen, and slept near the fire when the nights were cold. But the dog had one strange habit: it would often bark at nothing. In the middle of the courtyard, beneath the full moon or in broad daylight, it would suddenly stop, raise its head, and bark into open air. Sometimes once, sometimes a long howl. The younger monks would laugh. "What do you see?" they'd ask. "A ghost? A spirit?" One day, a visiting monk witnessed this and turned to Genjo. "Why does the dog bark at empty space?" he asked, half amused, half puzzled. Genjo simply replied, "He sees what we avoid." Later that evening, the monks gathered for teachings. The dog lay quietly beside the altar. Genjo began to speak, his voice slow and soft like the wind in the pines. "We all bark at emptiness in our own way," he said. "When silence comes, we fill it with noise. When space opens, we rush to close it. But this dog, he does not bark in fear. He barks in recognition." The monks grew quiet. "Emptiness is not a hole," Genjo continued. "It is not the absence of meaning, it is the place where everything begins. The dog barks not because something is missing, but because something is present too vast for the eye to see." The next morning, as the sun rose over the mountains, one of the younger monks sat alone in the courtyard. The dog padded up beside him and once again barked at the air. But this time the monk did not laugh. He closed his eyes, and for a brief, trembling moment, he too felt the weight of the silence, the fullness of the empty space around him. And he bowed. Moral of the story: emptiness is not nothingness. It is the stillness beneath all sound, the space that holds all things. We often fear it, distract ourselves from it, bark at it like the dog, but in truth, it is not our enemy. When we stop running from emptiness, we may begin to hear what it has always been trying to say. The next story is called The Monk Who Carried a Mirror in His Sleeve. In a quiet Zen temple perched along the edge of a misty mountain, there lived a monk named Enshu, who was unlike the others. While the rest chanted sutras, studied scriptures, or swept the temple grounds, Enshu carried with him a small mirror hidden inside the long sleeve of his robe. He never spoke of it. No one knew why he had it. But each day, at dawn and dusk, he would walk alone into the pine forest, take out the mirror, and gaze silently into it. Whispers followed him. Some monks mocked him behind his back. "He must be vain," they said. "He stares at his own face instead of meditating." One day, a curious novice, unable to hold back, followed Enshu into the trees. Hidden behind a rock, he watched. As the sun slipped behind the mountains, Enshu knelt, unwrapped the cloth from around the mirror, and looked into it. But something was different. His face was not proud. It was still, soft, almost sad. He whispered quietly to the glass, "Who is this? Who clings? Who suffers? Who hides?" Then, very gently, he touched the surface and bowed. The novice gasped, startled by the tenderness of it. Enshu turned and saw him. "Come," he said. "You've watched. Now sit." The boy sat beside him, nervous. Enshu placed the mirror between them. "This is not for vanity," Enshu said. "It is for remembering. Each morning, I look to see what face I bring to the world. Is it full of fear, of pride, of pretending? And each night, I ask, was I honest today? Did I see others clearly, only through my own shadow?" The boy stared into the mirror and, for the first time, saw not just his face but all the thoughts, masks, and stories behind it. Enshu smiled softly. "The mirror shows me the one thing I forget, again and again, myself. Without seeing myself clearly, I cannot truly see the world." Moral of the story: we often look outward, chasing meaning, approval, or peace. But true clarity begins within. Like a mirror held in silence, self-reflection can reveal what the mind hides. When we dare to see ourselves without judgment, we no longer fear our own face. We begin to meet it with compassion. And only then can we meet others the same way. The next story is called "When a Cloud Taught Meditation." In a mountain temple where the sky felt close and the wind moved like breath, a young monk named Ren struggled with his practice. Every day he sat for hours, his legs aching, his thoughts wild. He tried to focus on his breath, on stillness, on silence, but nothing worked. His mind was a storm. One morning, after a sleepless night of doubt, Ren approached his teacher. "Master," he said, "I cannot quiet my thoughts. I try and try, but they come like thunder. I sit still, but inside I'm shaking. Am I doing it wrong?" The old teacher didn't speak. He simply gestured for Ren to follow. They walked up a narrow path that led above the temple to a clearing where the earth fell away and the whole valley opened below. There they sat, side by side, watching the sky. Clouds drifted slowly overhead, soft, gray and shapeless. The wind was gentle. The teacher said nothing. Minutes passed. Then an hour. Finally, the master asked, "Did you tell the clouds where to go?" Ren blinked. "No, of course not." "Did you push them to move faster or slower?" Ren shook his head. "Did you judge their shapes?" "No, master. I just watched." The teacher turned to him, eyes clear and kind. "That," he said, "is meditation." Ren felt his breath stop. He looked up at the clouds again, how they came and went on their own, how they passed without resistance, how the sky never tried to hold them. In that moment, he understood. His thoughts, like clouds, did not need to be forced away. They could drift, they could change, and the sky of his mind could remain wide and open, untouched. He bowed deeply to the teacher, to the sky, to the clouds above. That day, he returned to the meditation hall not to fight his thoughts, but to let them float. His breath softened, his body loosened, and for the first time, stillness began to bloom inside him, quiet and effortless. Moral of the story: meditation is not about forcing the mind to be empty. It's about watching without clinging, like observing clouds pass across the sky. Thoughts come and go, but we are the sky, not the storm. When we stop struggling, the mind finds its own peace quietly, naturally, like a cloud drifting home. The next story is called "The Rice Grain That Enlightened a Farmer." In a quiet village surrounded by golden fields, there lived a humble farmer named Kenji. He was a man of few words and long days, waking before sunrise and working until the stars returned. He plowed, sowed, harvested, and repeated, Life was simple but heavy. He had no time for temples, no time for teachings, and no time for stillness. Enlightenment is for monks, he would say. I have a family to feed. But deep inside, when no one could see, Kenji carried a silent ache, a feeling that life was passing like smoke through his fingers. One evening, after a long harvest, he sat on his porch, exhausted. The moon hung low, and the air was still. He picked up a single grain of rice that had fallen from his bowl. It clung to his rough fingers, tiny and perfect. Something in him paused. He turned the grain between his fingers, watching how it caught the moonlight. It was so small, easily lost, easily ignored. Yet it had taken months of sun, soil, rain, and care to reach his hand. That single grain had once been hidden beneath the earth, and now it was food, life, a gift. Suddenly, the silence deepened. He wasn't thinking anymore. He was just there, breathing, holding the rice, and feeling time stretch open around him. He saw his entire life in that grain. The sweat of his father, the hands of his mother, the aching of his back, the laughter of his children, the rising and falling of seasons, everything in one grain. Tears rose without warning. He whispered, "All this in just one seed." The next morning, he returned to the fields, but something had changed. His work was not a burden, no, it was prayer. Every movement became a kind of meditation, every grain of rice, a teacher. Years later, people would speak of the old farmer who smiled even in storms, who bowed to his land, who taught without speaking. And when they asked him what he had learned, he would simply hold out his hand with one grain resting in his palm. Moral of the story: enlightenment isn't hidden in distant temples or rare teachings. It can be found in the smallest things we overlook. One grain of rice, fully seen, carries the entire universe. When we stop rushing through life and begin to notice what's already in our hands, even the most ordinary moment becomes sacred. The next story is called The Koan Etched on a Blade of Grass. Deep within a forest monastery, where paths were made by deer more than feet, there lived a monk named Shinji, quiet and intense. He had studied the sutras, sat long hours in zazen, and memorized dozens of koans, but none had brought him peace. He was diligent, disciplined, but still lost. His heart ached for an answer he could not name. One morning, the master handed Shinji a single koan. "Show me the nature of truth without using a single word." Shinji bowed and returned to his hut. For days, he sat with it. He wrote poems. He drew circles in the sand. He shouted into the trees. Nothing felt real. The more he tried, the heavier his mind became. Frustrated, he wandered into the forest to clear his thoughts. The sun had just begun to rise, and the air was thick with dew. Birds were waking. Everything was silent but alive. He stopped at a small clearing where light poured through the trees like honey. There, at his feet, he noticed a single blade of grass bent by the weight of a single drop of dew. The droplet trembled gently, catching the full morning light, sparkling like a jewel. And in that moment, something stopped inside him. He knelt down, not to touch it, but to see it fully. The blade of grass held no answers, no teachings, yet it was perfect. It did not try to be more than it was. It bent, it held, it shimmered and said everything. Tears welled in Shinji's eyes. He picked a nearby twig and gently carved a tiny circle into the earth beside the grass, then walked back to the monastery without a single word. The master met him at the gate. "Have you found the answer?" he asked. Shinji bowed low and said, "It was already there. I had only to bow to it." Moral of the story: sometimes the answer to the deepest questions is not found in books, thoughts, or effort. It appears in a moment of complete presence. A blade of grass, a drop of dew, a breath in stillness, These hold the koan the mind cannot solve. When the heart is quiet, even the smallest thing becomes a doorway to the infinite. The next story is called The Jar That Collected Breaths. In a village near the edge of the desert, there was an old woman named Aya who lived alone in a small clay house. She was not a monk, not a teacher, not a scholar, just a quiet soul with a kind smile and eyes that watched everything. People often passed her by without notice, but the children liked her. They said she carried magic. On a shelf in Aya's home sat a single glass jar with a worn lid. It looked ordinary, empty, dusty, unremarkable, but Aya treated it with great care. Each morning, she would sit before it in silence, close her eyes, and breathe slowly. Then she would open the jar, exhale gently into it, close the lid, and bow. She did this every day, for years. One day, a young traveler came to the village, full of questions and impatience. He had studied with masters and visited temples, but peace still escaped him. Restless, he wandered into Aya's home, drawn by curiosity. Seeing the jar on the shelf, he asked, "What is this? Why breathe into something so small? What could it possibly hold?" Aya smiled and said, "It holds everything." The traveler laughed. "It's just air, just breath." Aya nodded. "Yes, just breath. The breath I took the day my husband died. The breath I took the first time I forgave someone. The breath I offered during the drought, when I had no water but gave thanks anyway. Each breath a moment I was fully alive." The traveler stared at the jar. It looked no fuller than before. Aya continued, "Most people throw their breaths away. They rush through them, waste them in worry, spill them in anger. But each breath is a gift, a doorway, a chance to return. I collect them, so I never forget that I lived." The room fell silent. The traveler sat down, quietly, and for the first time in a long time, he took a breath, not to move forward, not to escape, but just to be. Moral of the story: every breath is a moment we are given. Most pass unnoticed, lost in noise and haste, but when we become aware, even one breath can open the heart. Peace is not found in distant truths. It begins when we stop, breathe, and recognize the sacred in the simple. Like a jar filled with silent moments, our life becomes full when we begin to notice it. The next story is called The Wind's Reply to a Question. A young monk named Tenzin once traveled to a distant monastery in search of a teacher said to answer any question with clarity so deep it could silence the mind. Tenzin had studied hard, meditated long, and still the same question haunted him: what is truth? No answer had satisfied him, not from scriptures, not from scholars. He longed for something beyond explanation. After many days of walking, he arrived at the old mountain temple. He bowed before the abbot and asked, "Master, I have one question. Please tell me what is truth." The master looked up from his sweeping and said, "Go sit beneath the cedar tree at the edge of the cliff. Ask your question there." Tenzin, confused but obedient, made his way to the cliff where the great cedar tree stood, its roots gripping the rocky earth, its branches high and wild. The view overlooked a vast valley. The wind was strong there, and the world below seemed far away. He sat down, closed his eyes, and asked aloud, "What is truth?" At first, there was no reply, only the sound of leaves rustling and the wind pushing through the trees. He waited, then asked again, "What is truth?" Still, no voice answered, only a gust of wind that pushed his robe, brushed his cheek, and whistled through the canyon. Again and again he asked, and again, only the wind came. After a time, something inside him changed. His urgency faded. He stopped waiting for a voice, stopped expecting words. He simply sat and listened. The wind became everything. It rose and fell, soft then sharp, carrying the scent of pine and stone. It moved without purpose, spoke without sound. It touched him fully and left nothing behind. In that moment, Tenzin understood. The wind was the answer, not because it explained truth, but because it was truth. Moving, changing, empty, full, always here, yet never held. He returned to the monastery and bowed to the master. "Did the wind answer you?" the master asked. Tenzin smiled. "It said everything I needed and nothing at all." Moral of the story: some questions are not meant to be solved with words. Truth does not always come as a statement. It may come as a breeze, a silence, a presence. When we stop forcing answers and simply listen, the world itself begins to speak. And sometimes the wind carries the clearest reply. The next story is called The Moon, reflected in a drop of sake. In a quiet inn nestled among the hills of Kyoto, there lived an elderly man named Shoji, who had once been a Zen monk. After many years in the monastery, he left without explanation and never spoke of why. Instead, he ran a small sake house, serving warm rice wine to travelers and villagers who came not just for the drink but for the calm in his eyes. Shoji had a ritual. Each night, before closing, he would pour himself one small cup of sake and sit outside beneath the open sky. He never drank it right away. He simply held the cup, waiting for the moon to rise. One cold autumn night, a young poet staying at the inn watched from the porch. "Why do you wait?" he finally asked. "It's just sake. It will cool." Shoji held the cup up and pointed. "Look." The poet leaned in. Floating in the still surface of the sake was the full moon, perfect, round, trembling slightly in the breeze. Shoji whispered, "Every night I wait for this moment, not to drink, but to see." The moon, reflected in something so small. It reminds me that no matter how vast the sky may be, it can live inside a single drop. The poet fell silent. Shoji continued, "When I was younger, I chased the moon itself through teachings, temples, long meditations. I thought enlightenment would come like thunder. But then one night, I saw the moon inside my sake, and I understood." "What did you understand?" the poet asked. "That truth doesn't live in the sky. It lives in how you see it. The moon is always present, but only when the mind is still can you see its reflection." Shoji smiled, then finally took a slow sip. The sake had cooled, but the moon remained. Moral of the story: we often seek greatness in far-off places, in the stars, in achievements, in answers beyond our reach. But the vastness of life can appear in the smallest of moments if we are present. A single drop of stillness can hold the whole sky. Like the moon in a cup of sake, truth is not found through striving, but through quiet seeing. When the heart is calm, the whole universe reflects within. The next story is called The Door That Was Never Opened. In a centuries-old monastery nestled deep in the mountains, there was a hallway with many rooms, each one used for study, prayer, or sleep. But at the very end of that hallway, hidden behind faded tapestries, stood a single wooden door. It was plain, worn smooth by time, and always locked. None of the monks used it. No one had seen it open. It was simply there. Over time, the door became a mystery. Young monks whispered about it late at night. Some said it led to a sacred library. Others believed it hid a passage to enlightenment. A few feared it, calling it the door to emptiness, to the place beyond words. One novice monk named Haru became obsessed with it. Day after day, after his duties were done, he would sit in front of the door, staring at it, wondering. He imagined what might lie beyond. A great truth? A final answer? A silence so deep it would dissolve all questions. He tried the handle many times, always locked. He dreamt of finding the key. Sometimes he even pressed his ear to the wood, hoping to hear something, anything. Years passed. One day, as the abbot walked by, he saw Haru still sitting before the door. "Why do you spend so much time here?" the abbot asked gently. Haru replied, "Because I know what I'm searching for is behind this door. If I could just open it, I would finally understand." The abbot was silent for a long time. Then he said, "Come with me." He led Haru outside, to the garden. The sun was warm, the wind soft, birds sang in the trees. The abbot stopped and looked around. "Here," he said, "this is the door you've been waiting to open." Haru blinked, confused. "But this is just the garden." The abbot nodded. "Exactly. You've been sitting in front of that door, waiting for something beyond your life. But the Dharma doesn't hide behind locks. It lives in this breath, this breeze, this very moment. That door, it never needed to open because nothing was hidden." Haru felt something in him break open, a door not in the wall, but in his chest. Moral of the story: we often wait for life to begin, imagining it lies just behind the next goal, the next answer, the next door. But truth is not hidden. It has always been here in this moment, this breath, this step. The door that was never opened teaches us. The search ends when we stop waiting and finally arrive. The next story is called "The Girl Who Gave a Cone as Her Name." In a village cradled by rivers and quiet trees, there lived a little girl named Aya. She was no older than 10, with a voice soft as wind and eyes that seemed too still for someone so young. She rarely spoke unless spoken to, but when she did, her words often left people quiet, confused, or oddly comforted. One day, a traveling monk passed through the village. He stayed at the local temple and offered to give teachings to anyone who came. Curious villagers filled the hall, asking questions about suffering, karma, the afterlife. The monk answered each with clarity and calm. At the end of the talk, Aya stepped forward. The monk smiled, expecting a child's question. But she bowed deeply and said, "I am not Aya. I am the sound of one footstep in a field of snow. Who am I?" The hall fell silent. The monk blinked, surprised, then laughed gently. "Is that a riddle?" Aya only smiled. "It is my name," she said, then turned and walked away. Days passed. The monk could not forget her words. The sound of one footstep in a field of snow. He repeated it during meditation. He whispered it as he walked. It was quiet, strange, beautiful, and it stayed with him like breath on a mirror. He asked the villagers about her. They told him Aya was not taught such things. She simply listened a lot. She liked to walk alone. And once, when a neighbor was grieving, Aya sat beside her without saying a word, and somehow the woman wept and healed. Before leaving, the monk found Aya again. "Why did you call yourself that?" he asked. She tilted her head and said softly, "Because I do not last. I appear, then I melt. But for a moment, you feel me." The monk bowed deeply. He left with no more answers but something deeper than understanding. Moral of the story: some truths cannot be explained. Like a koan, they must be felt. A name is often a label, a sound, but when we live with presence, our very being becomes a teaching. The deepest wisdom does not always come from age, but from silence, from stillness, from one quiet step in fresh, snow-felt, then gone. The next story is called "The Bamboo That Bowed to a Fly." In a lush Zen garden behind a quiet temple, there stood a single stalk of bamboo taller than the rest. It was strong, graceful, and known for swaying with the wind like a dancer in silence. The monks often sat near it during meditation, drawn to its elegance and calm. But one summer afternoon, a small, tired fly buzzed through the garden, circling clumsily in the heat. It landed barely noticeable on the uppermost leaf of the bamboo. The leaf bent just slightly under the fly's weight. A novice monk nearby saw this and laughed softly. "Even a fly thinks it's mighty," he muttered. An older monk overheard and motioned for the novice to sit beside him. "Tell me," the elder said, "why do you think the bamboo bowed?" The novice shrugged. "It's just a reflex. The bamboo's soft, the fly is nothing." The old monk smiled. "Yes, the fly is small, but the bamboo still bent for it. That is strength not in resisting, but in yielding with grace." The novice looked back at the bamboo. The leaf had returned to stillness. The fly had moved on, unnoticed, unthanked. But the moment had left something behind, an impression, not on the bamboo, but in the young monk's heart. Later that night, as rain began to fall lightly on the temple roof, the elder returned to the story. The bamboo does not ask, "Is this worthy of my bow?" It simply responds to life. In its bending, it loses nothing, but it gives everything: shelter, softness, space. That's the nature of true humility. No matter how tall we grow, we must still bow to the smallest things. The novice closed his eyes, his breath slowing with the rain. He thought of the bamboo, the fly, the quiet gesture no one saw, and felt something soften inside him. Moral of the story: real strength is quiet, and true humility is effortless. We often think power lies in being firm, but the bamboo teaches us the opposite, that to bend, to respond with gentleness even to the smallest of lives, is a deeper kind of wisdom. When we bow to the world without judgment, we live in harmony with all things, great and small. The next story is called "When a Master Slept in a Coffin for 7 Days." In a windswept monastery at the edge of the forest, there lived a Zen master known simply as Kozen. He was quiet, ordinary in appearance, and rarely taught in words. His students loved him, but they also feared his silence. He had a way of looking at you that made your thoughts stop mid-sentence. One morning, without warning or ceremony, Kozen called his students into the courtyard. There, beneath a grey sky, stood a wooden coffin. No explanation, no smile. He stepped inside it, lay down, and closed the lid. The students were stunned. They stood in silence, waiting for a message, a sign, a lesson, but the coffin remained still. Hours passed, then a day, then 2. By the 3rd day, fear turned into panic. "Has he died?" they whispered. Some pleaded to open the coffin. Others said, "No's teaching us something. He must be." By the 5th day, the tension was unbearable. The monks sat in meditation near the coffin, unable to focus. The air felt heavier, the world more fragile. On the morning of the 7th day, as the first rays of sun touched the temple stones, the coffin creaked open. Slowly, Kozen rose. His robes were rumpled. His face was pale, but calm still as water. He looked at his students, who stared at him with wide eyes, waiting for some profound revelation. Kozen simply said, "Now you understand," and walked away. Later, one monk ran after him, desperate. "Master, what did you mean? Understand what?" Kozen stopped. He looked the monk in the eyes and said, "You feared death because you have not met life. You waited for my teaching while it was already happening." The monk fell to his knees, tears rising without knowing why. Kozen whispered, "7 days in a coffin is not so different from 7 days on a cushion, but one forces you to see what you avoid." Then he returned to sweeping the courtyard. Moral of the story: death is not a future event, it is a mirror held to our life right now. We fear it because we haven't truly lived, but when we sit in its shadow without running, we begin to see clearly. Every breath becomes more sacred, every moment more awake. The coffin wasn't a stunt, it was a doorway, and through it, the master didn't teach about death, he taught how to live. The next story is called "The Dust That Refused to Settle." There was once a monk named Jinan who swept the temple grounds each morning before the sun had fully risen. It was a practice he took seriously, not just to clean, but to quiet his mind. Each stroke of the broom was like a breath. Each pile of leaves, a letting go. But there was one corner of the courtyard where the dust would never stay down. No matter how carefully Jinen swept, the wind would blow and the dust would rise again, spiraling gently into the air, then settling back just where it wasn't wanted. Jinen began to grow frustrated. He swept harder, faster. He poured water on the ground. He even blocked the wind with stones and branches. But still, the dust lifted again, light, defiant, dancing. After weeks of struggle, Jinen went to his master and said, "I do everything I can, but the dust keeps returning. What am I doing wrong?" The master looked at him with calm eyes and said, "Perhaps it is not the dust that must settle." Jinen blinked. "But I'm the one who sweeps." "Yes," the master said, "and perhaps also the one who stirs." That night, Jinen sat long into the evening, watching the wind move through the lantern light. He realized he had been fighting a moment, not understanding it. Wanting stillness so badly, he had become the source of his own restlessness. The next morning, he returned to the courtyard. He swept, but not to control. He let the dust rise. He let the wind dance. He moved with the rhythm of things, not against them. And in that simple shift, something softened. The dust still lifted, but now so did his mind. It no longer needed to land. Moral of the story: sometimes peace isn't found in making everything settle, it's found in learning to settle ourselves. Life will always stir, the wind will blow, thoughts will rise like dust. But when we stop fighting what moves and move with it instead, we begin to see true stillness doesn't come from stopping the world, it comes from not needing it to stop. The next story is called The Enlightenment in a Fallen Leaf. There once lived an old monk named Tenzo who spent most of his life tending to the temple garden. He was not known for fiery teachings or deep scholarly debate. He rarely spoke in the Dharma hall. Yet everyone in the monastery respected him, though no one quite knew why. Tenzo had a habit. Each morning, before anyone else stirred, he would walk the stone path through the garden in silence. He would pause at the same spot near the maple tree and wait. Sometimes he stood there for minutes, sometimes for hours. The younger monks often watched him curiously from a distance. One autumn morning, just as the trees began shedding their color, a student approached. He had struggled for years with meditation, unable to quiet his mind. Desperate, he bowed and asked, "Master Tenzo, how do I find peace? How do I awaken?" Tenzo did not speak. Instead, he pointed to the branch above them. A single red leaf clung gently to the edge, trembling in the morning wind. The student looked up, confused. Then, just as the sun peeked over the horizon, the leaf let go. It didn't fall quickly. It spun, drifted, floated slowly downward, catching bits of sunlight like gold in motion. The world seemed to pause. Even the student's breath stilled. The leaf landed softly on the stone at their feet, silent, complete. Tenzo looked at the student. "Did you see?" The student nodded slowly, but tears had filled his eyes. Something had cracked open inside him, something soft, ancient, and quiet. "It didn't resist," Tenzo said. "It didn't cling. It fell because the moment had come, and it did not fear the ground." The student sat down beside him and whispered, "That leaf, it was perfect." Tenzo smiled gently. "So are you." From that day on, the student no longer asked how to awaken. He only watched more closely each leaf, each step, each breath, a small gate into something endless. Moral of the story: awakening doesn't always come through struggle or effort. Sometimes it drifts down quietly like a leaf, showing us how to let go. When we stop clinging, whether to control, to self, or to time, we fall not into loss, but into truth. Enlightenment is not a lightning strike. It is the soft recognition that life, in its quiet unfolding, has already arrived. The next story is called The Monk Who Meditated on a Raindrop. In a secluded monastery nestled in a valley where clouds often kissed the hills, there lived a monk named Tario who had become disheartened with his practice. He had studied all the sutras, memorized verses, and sat through countless sessions of meditation, yet his heart still felt unsettled. Enlightenment, it seemed, was always one breath out of reach. One rainy afternoon, after failing once again to quiet his mind during meditation, Tario went outside in frustration. The sky was low and grey, the sound of raindrops steady on the leaves, the roof, the earth. He wandered until he reached a stone ledge beside a shallow pool, where a single droplet of rain hung from a bent reed above the water. He sat down and watched it. The raindrop trembled with weight, stretching slowly as more water gathered from the reed. It looked ready to fall, but didn't. Tario leaned closer, held his breath, and simply stared. The wind whispered through the trees. The rest of the world faded, and still the raindrop remained. Time passed minutes or hours, he couldn't tell. He had no thoughts, no plans, no struggle. Only stillness, only breath, only the raindrop, round and full, holding the sky in its tiny body. Then at last, without effort or noise, it fell on small drop, touching the surface of the pool and sending perfect rings outward in every direction. Tario felt something open inside him. The drop had done nothing. It hadn't tried, it hadn't forced. It had simply waited until the right moment, and then it let go. And the world received it in silence. Tears welled in his eyes, not of sadness, but of recognition. From that day forward, Tario no longer chased awakening. He sat not to achieve, but to listen. He walked not to arrive, but to feel the ground. He became known not for his wisdom, but for his quiet presence, like rain falling with no need to be noticed. Moral of the story: sometimes the greatest truths are not spoken, they are witnessed. A single raindrop can teach what words cannot. Patience, presence, and the art of letting go. Enlightenment does not come through force or reaching it, comes in the moment we are fully here, watching, waiting, and open to fall. The next story is called The Sutra That Floated Downstream. In a remote monastery nestled along the edge of a winding river, a young monk named Haru was entrusted with a sacred task. His master gave him an ancient scroller, handwritten sutra, said to have been copied by a revered ancestor. The ink had faded with time, but the words still pulsed with meaning. "Take this sutra to the neighboring temple," the master said. "Guard it well. It is not just paper. It is the breath of many lifetimes." Haru bowed deeply, wrapping the sutra in layers of cloth. As he walked along the riverbank, the path was peaceful, his steps steady. But halfway through his journey, the wind picked up and rain began to fall. The bank grew slick. In one careless step, Haru slipped. The sutra flew from his arms and into the rushing water. He jumped, panicked, trying to catch it, but the current was swift. The scroll spun, unwrapped, and drifted downstream, vanishing from sight. Haru fell to his knees in the mud, heart pounding with shame. The sacred words were gone. He had failed. When he returned to the monastery, soaked and trembling, he collapsed before his master. "I lost it," he cried. "The sutra. I couldn't save it." The old master said nothing. He walked outside and sat by the river. After a long silence, he pointed to the water. "Look," he said, "it is still flowing." Haru blinked, unsure. "The sutra was never just in your hands," the master continued. "It was in your breath as you carried it, in the trees that made its paper, in the river that now carries it forward. Do you think the Dharma lives only in ink?" The master closed his eyes. "Let it go. It is not lost. It is moving." That night, Haru sat by the river. The water murmured softly, like a voice without words. He realized then the teachings weren't something to grasp tightly. They were something to release, to live, to let move through him like the current. Moral of the story: wisdom cannot be contained in scrolls or clutched with fear. True understanding flows like water, free, ungraspable, alive. We suffer when we try to hold too tightly to the sacred, believing it can be lost. But the Dharma is never lost. It simply moves. And when we learn to flow with it, we become part of the teaching itself. The next story is called The Smile That Drove Away Mara. On the eve of his great awakening, as Siddhartha Gautama sat beneath the Bodhi tree in deep meditation, the sky darkened with more than night. From the shadows rose Marath, lord of illusion, master of fear, and weaver of desire. He came not with weapons, but with whispers. "You are wasting your time," Mara hissed. "You are just a man. Who are you to seek truth beyond gods and lifetimes?" He conjured visions: gold, fame, power, pleasures of the senses, storms of doubt. He summoned demons, sent arrows of fear, and laid storms upon Siddhartha's mind. But Siddhartha did not speak. He did not argue. He simply smiled. It was a soft, still smile, not of pride, but of knowing. In that smile lived the quiet of countless lifetimes. It held every hunger he had once clung to, and every fear he had released. It was not defiance. It was understanding. Mara paused. His illusions began to flicker. "Why do you smile?" Mara demanded. "Do you not see what I offer? Do you not fear what I am?" Siddhartha opened his eyes, full of peace. "I see you," he said gently. "And because I see you, you have no power." Mara fell silent. No resistance, no struggle, no hate, just pure awareness. The demons vanished, the temptations dissolved. The storm stilled not because it was defeated, but because it was no longer fed. Mara, with all his illusions, turned and disappeared into the darkness, not banished by force, but by the light of calm recognition. The next morning, Siddhartha would awaken not just from sleep, but from all delusion and become the Buddha. But it was that simple smile on the night before dawn that marked his greatest victory. Moral of the story: sometimes the most powerful response to fear, doubt, or temptation is not to fight, but to see it clearly and meet it with compassion. Awareness breaks illusion. When we stop feeding fear with resistance, it loses its shape. The Buddha's smile teaches us that peace is not the absence of challenge, but the presence of clarity, and that even Mara's deepest shadows can be driven away with a single fearless smile. The next story is called The Bodhisattva Beneath the Floorboards. In a forgotten corner of a rural temple, where wind crept through cracks and dust settled quietly over the years, the wooden floorboards creaked beneath the weight of each step. The monks rarely used this room. It was too cold in winter, too still in summer. Yet one day, a young novice named Ren was assigned to clean it. Grumbling silently, broom in hand, Ren pushed open the creaky door and entered the dim space. It smelled of old incense and thyme. He swept half-heartedly, eager to finish. But as he dragged the broom across the far side of the room, a loose board shifted under his foot. Curious, he knelt down and pried it up. Beneath the floor, wrapped in cloth worn thin by age, lay a small wooden statuette's surface faded, a gentle smile carved into its face. It was a bodhisattva, seated in stillness, one hand raised in blessing, the other resting lightly in its lap. Ren stared at it, confused. He had walked over this spot countless times. No one had ever mentioned it. Why had it been hidden? He brought it to the abbot. The old man's eyes softened with recognition. "Ah," he said quietly. "I wondered when someone would find it." "Why was it buried under the floor?" Ren asked. The abbot placed the statue on the altar and bowed. During a war, long ago, when this temple was nearly destroyed, one monk hid the bodhisattva to protect it from fire and soldiers. He died before he could recover it, and we forgot. Ren lowered his head, ashamed. We walked over it for years. We never even noticed. The abbot smiled. Yes, like the wisdom inside ourselves, we walk over it every day. We build our lives upon it, and still we forget it's there. That evening, the statue sat quietly on the altar once again, candlelight dancing over its worn face. And Ren, now kneeling in silence, no longer looked outside for meaning. He had found it beneath his own feet. Moral of the story: the sacred is not always lost, it is often simply buried beneath the noise of our lives. In our hurry, we step over it, unaware. But beneath every ordinary moment lies something ancient, still, and waiting to be seen. Like the bodhisattva under the floorboards, truth is not far. It's beneath us, within us, quiet, patient, and always ready to be remembered. The next story is called The Horse Who Answered a Koan. In the rolling countryside of old Japan, there was a monastery surrounded by wide pastures. The monks lived simply, cultivating rice, practicing meditation, and tending to animals. Among them was a young monk named Riku, known for his serious nature and deep longing for awakening. He had been given a difficult koan by his teacher. What was your original face before your parents were born? He pondered it day and night. He wrote poems, fasted, sat in silence, walked in circles. But no matter how he approached the question, his mind tangled in itself. The more he thought, the farther the answer seemed. One restless morning, after yet another long night of meditation, Riku wandered into the pasture where the temple's old horse grazed. The horse, named Hoshi, was gentle, with a coat faded by age and eyes deep as still water. Riku sat down beside Hoshi, exhausted. I don't know, he whispered. What was my face before I was born? Who am I? Hoshi raised his head, looked at the monk with calm curiosity, and let out a long, slow breath through his nose. Then he walked forward and gently nuzzled Riku's chest just once before, lowering his head to graze again. Riku sat still. He hadn't expected an answer. But something in that moment broke open. No words, no thought, just the soft warmth of a living being, utterly present. No future, no past. Just this moment, breath against breath. Tears welled in Riku's eyes. He bowed deeply to the horse, who paid him no mind at all. Later that day, he returned to his teacher, bowed, and said, I have seen my original face. The teacher looked into his eyes and nodded, saying nothing. Moral of the story: the deepest truths often arrive not through thinking, but through presence. A koan is not a riddle to be solved, but a mirror that breaks the mind so the heart can see. Even a horse, calm, ordinary, alive in the moment, can carry the answer without a single word. When we stop trying to grasp the truth, it comes to meet us, softly, like breath on the chest. The next story is called The Stone That Sang in the Rain. Deep in the hills of an old Zen province, there was a stone garden tended by a single caretaker, an elderly monk named Ishin. The garden was simple, a flat bed of sand, carefully raked each morning, with 7 large stones placed in deliberate stillness. Pilgrims traveled from far villages to walk in silence through the garden. They said it calmed the soul, that the air there felt quieter. But what no one knew, what only Ishin had experienced, was that one of the stones would sometimes sing. Not always. Not when the sun was bright or when birds filled the air, only when it rained. Ishin had first heard it as a young monk. During a storm, as he sat under the eaves in zazen, the rain began to fall. Slow at first, then steadily. And then from deep within the garden came a soft, low hum. A vibration, almost a whisper, not made by wind, not from dripping branches. It came from the stone. He opened his eyes. The sound was not music. It had no rhythm, no form, but it was alive. It moved through his chest, not his ears. It was as if the stone so still, so ordinary, had something to say, but only when no one else was listening. Ishin said nothing. He simply returned to sit again every time it rained. Over the years, he heard it many times, sometimes loud, sometimes faint, but always during the quietest storms, when the rain was soft, when the mind was empty. Once a novice asked, "Master, why do you never hide from the rain?" Ishin only smiled and replied, "Because some teachings fall from the sky." He never spoke of the singing stone. It wasn't meant to be proven, only felt. Even in old age, when his hands trembled and he could no longer rake the sand, Ishin would sit outside in the rain, eyes closed, listening. And on the day he passed away, the clouds wept gently, and those near the garden swore they felt something in the earth, a hum, a note with no beginning, no end. Moral of the story: not all truth is loud. Some wisdom speaks in stillness, in rain, in things others overlook. The world teaches in many forms, but we must become quiet enough to hear. Even a stone unmoving, unchanging may sing, if we learn how to listen. The next story is called A Monastery in a Cloud's Shadow. High on a mountain ledge, so high that even the birds flew below it, there stood a tiny monastery cloaked in silence. The monks who lived there rarely spoke, for the clouds passed so closely overhead that even their thoughts felt watched. The sky was their teacher, the wind their sutra, and they bowed each morning not to statues, but to the horizon. It was said the monastery had been built in a single day, in the space between storms, and that it vanished from sight whenever the clouds descended. A young seeker named Nico climbed the mountain alone, hungry for truth, eager for answers. He had studied in many temples, memorized teachings, and conquered long meditations, but still, a quiet ache followed him. He believed that if he could reach this mysterious monastery, he would finally understand. When he arrived, exhausted and trembling, a monk welcomed him without words and offered him tea. The fog outside wrapped around the building like a living robe. Nothing could be seen beyond the portionly white, endless and still. Nico asked, "Where are the teachings?" The monk pointed to the mist. Nico frowned. "But I can't see anything." The monk only smiled and said, "Then you are beginning." Days passed. Nico swept, cooked, and meditated, but no lessons came. No one gave him a scroll. No master asked him a koan. Only the fog remained thick in the morning, thin at noon, glowing silver in moonlight. He grew frustrated. Until one evening, while sitting outside in silence, the clouds shifted. Just for a moment, the entire valley below appeared vast, green, glowing in the setting sun. Then, as quickly as it came, it vanished back into mist. Nico sat frozen. His breath had stilled. The glimpse had been brief, but inside it lived something vast. He hadn't reached for it. He hadn't earned it. It had come on its own, gracefully, briefly then passed. And suddenly, he understood. The truth was not hidden. It was always there, just behind the mist of his expectations. The monastery had never been about seeing clearly, but about learning to trust what cannot always be seen. Moral of the story: wisdom does not always come in clear lines and open skies. Sometimes it arrives in glimpses, quiet, passing, like a view between clouds. The mind wants clarity, but the heart learns to sit in mist. When we stop demanding answers, the truth appears not always for long, but always enough. And then, like the clouds, it returns to silence. The next story is called The Drumbeat. that ended desire. In a high mountain monastery where clouds often rested low across the paths, there lived a monk named Riku who had trained with great discipline. His posture was perfect, his rituals exact. Yet his heart burned with longing not for riches, not for power, but for something he couldn't name. A sense of almost followed him like a shadow. He wanted to awaken, but no matter how many sutras he memorized or how long he meditated, peace always felt just beyond reach. One spring, a traveling musician arrived at the monastery gates. She was invited to stay a few nights. She carried no belongings, only an old drum small, worn, bound in faded leather. She did not speak much, but each evening she sat in the courtyard and played just one beat, one single beat. Badum. Then silence. The monks found it strange. Some dismissed her. But Riku felt something stir in that one sound, like a wave that rose and fell before he could catch it. On the third night, Riku approached her. "Why do you only play once?" he asked. "You travel all this way for just one beat?" The woman looked at him with a smile as gentle as twilight. "One beat is enough if you're truly listening." That night, Riku could not sleep. The next morning, before dawn, he found her by the cliffside, drum resting on her lap. "Play it again," he asked. She nodded, closed her eyes, raised her hand. Badum. The sound echoed into the valley, soft and full. Then silence. But this time, something shifted. In that moment between the beat and the stillness, Riku felt it all: his desires, all his seeking, all his needing, dissolve. He realized it wasn't peace he was chasing, it was a perfect moment, free from grasping, and the beat had given it to him. The musician opened her eyes. "You heard it this time." Riku bowed deeply. "Yes," he said, "and I don't need another." She left the next day, walking down the path with her drum swinging at her side. Moral of the story: desire blinds us to the present. We chase more wisdom, more peace, more truth-believing. It lies in the next step. But sometimes one clear sound, one breath, one moment of complete attention is enough. When we stop grasping, we hear the drumbeat of life itself, and it asks for nothing more. The next story is called "The Girl Who Lit Incense with Her Breath." In a village where the river met the forest, there lived a young girl named Amai. She was not a monk nor a scholar. She didn't know the sutras, and she had never been to a temple. But each morning before dawn, she would walk alone to a small stone shrine beneath an old tree and offer a single stick of incense to the sky. She had no matches, no fire, no candle. She simply knelt, closed her eyes, whispered a few quiet words, and breathed. And somehow, though no one understood how the incense would glow at its tip and begin to burn. People spoke of magic, of miracles, of hidden tricks. Some laughed, some were afraid. But Amai only smiled when asked and said softly, "It's not my breath that lights the incense, it's what's inside it." One day, a wandering monk named Saito came to the village. He had heard stories of the girl who could light incense with breath alone, and he was skeptical. "I have seen many illusions," he said, "but never one that smelled of the truth." At sunrise, he followed her to the shrine. She knelt as always, took a deep breath, and whispered a prayer. The monk leaned forward, watching closely. And then it happened: the faintest ember, the tiniest glow, a curl of smoke rising into the pale morning air. He felt something inside him go still. Later, he approached her and asked, "What did you say when you whispered to the incense?" She looked up at him with clear, quiet eyes. "I said thank you," she answered. "To the sky, to the trees, to being alive." The monk stood in silence, humbled. He had studied koans for decades, crossed mountains for teachings, and yet, in that one breath of gratitude, he had felt something far deeper than words. Moral of the story: sometimes the most powerful awakening doesn't come from temples, teachings, or tradition. It comes from sincerity. A pure heart, full of gratitude, can light what the clever mind cannot. When we stop trying to control the sacred and simply bow to it, even our breath becomes fire, and in that flame, something eternal is revealed. The next story is called The Enlightened Thief. In a small village on the outskirts of a vast forest, there lived a man named Jiro, known by many names, but most simply called him the Thief. He was clever, silent, and skilled. He never harmed, but he took what he needed or what he wanted and vanished into the night like a shadow. Some cursed him, others admired his cunning, but no one knew his face. One night, Jiro crept into a nearby temple, drawn by rumors of golden statues and jeweled offerings. The moonlight spilled across the floor as he slipped through the open gate. But when he entered the main hall, he found nothing glittering, no gold, no guards, only a single candle burning beside a sleeping monk. Jiro stepped lightly, his eyes scanning the room. As he reached for a box near the altar, the monk stirred and opened his eyes. Not startled, not angry, just awake. "You've come," the monk said softly, sitting up. Jiro froze. "I didn't mean to wake you." The monk smiled. "You haven't disturbed me. In fact, I've been waiting." "For me?" "For anyone who comes searching," the monk said. "Please, take what you need." Jiro blinked. "You're not going to stop me?" "No," the monk replied. "But if you're going to steal, at least take something of real value." He walked to the corner of the room and returned with a small cup of tea, warm and fragrant. "Here, you must be cold." Jiro stood in silence, unsure of what to do. Slowly, he sat. He took the tea. The monk poured another for himself, and for a while, neither of them spoke. Finally, the thief asked, "Why are you being kind to me?" The monk looked into his cup. "Because I know what it's like to search in the wrong places." That night, Jiro left with no gold, no jewels, only a warmth in his chest that he couldn't name. He never stole again. Years later, a gentleman arrived at a distant monastery, seeking to become a monk. He bowed low and said, "I have taken many things in this life, but what I received in return without force, without anger, was the only thing that ever changed me." Moral of the story: compassion disarms where punishment fails. True transformation doesn't come through fear, it comes through unexpected kindness. When someone meets us with understanding instead of judgment, it opens a door within. Even the darkest hearts carry the seed of light, waiting not to be forced, but to be seen. The next story is called The Cat That Knew Zazen. At a small countryside monastery, quiet and plain, there lived a cat named Miro. She had wandered in as a kitten one rainy afternoon and never left. The monks fed her scraps, and she spent her days lounging in the sun, curling up on folded robes and slipping silently between meditation cushions. But what made Miro different wasn't her presence, it was her stillness. Each time the monks gathered for zazen, she would enter the meditation hall just before the bell rang. She would choose a spot in the center, sit upright, tail neatly curled around her feet, eyes half closed. And there she would remain motionless, hour after hour, sometimes longer than the monks themselves. New students were always startled. "Is she trained?" they asked. "Did someone teach her?" The senior monk would only smile. "No one taught her," he said. "She remembers." Years passed. Miro grew older, slower, but she never missed a single sitting. When storms came and monks trembled in their robes, Miro remained still. When someone wept in silence during deep meditation, she would open her eyes for just a moment and gaze calm, unmoved, endlessly present. One day, a young monk named Daikiristless and full of doubt spoke to the abbot in frustration. "I've read the sutras, I've followed the breath. I've recited mantras. Still, my mind is chaos. But look at her, he said, pointing to Miro, who was sitting peacefully by the window. She does nothing, and yet she's more centered than all of us. The abbot chuckled. That's because she doesn't sit to gain anything, he said. She doesn't strive to become enlightened. She doesn't fight with thought. She just sits. And in doing nothing, she becomes everything. Daiki turned to look at Miro. Her ears twitched slightly. The wind moved through the leaves outside. She blinked, then slowly closed her eyes again, completely at ease, perfectly at rest. And for the first time, Daiki stopped trying to meditate. He simply sat. Moral of the story. Zazen is not a technique. It is not a battle with the mind. It is the art of being fully present, without clinging or resistance. When we stop trying to reach something, we arrive. The cat knew no doctrine, chased no truth, she simply was. And sometimes that is the most awakened state of all. The next story is called The Flame That Would Not Burn the Paper. In a quiet Zen monastery, hidden between cypress trees and the edge of a silent lake, there lived a young monk named Naoki. He was devoted and bright, but his heart was restless. His thoughts burned like fire questions, doubts, desires, ambitions. He wanted awakening, wanted answers, wanted something he couldn't name. One evening, his master handed him a blank sheet of rice paper and said, "Take this and sit by the fire. Watch carefully, but do not burn it until you understand why you must." Naoki obeyed. He sat alone in the meditation hall, the fire crackling beside him. The paper lay untouched in his lap, light as breath. He stared into the flames, waiting for a sign, a feeling, an insight. But none came. He watched shadows dance on the walls. Hours passed. Finally, frustration flared. "What is this lesson?" he muttered. "Why wait? Why not just burn it?" He reached toward the fire, but something stopped him. He looked again at the paper. It was nothing special, thin, plain, but in that moment he imagined everything it could become. A sutra, a poem, a letter never sent, a child's first drawing. He saw the potential it carried, not in what it was, but in what it had not yet become. Suddenly, the fire seemed different too. Not just heat, it was hunger. It destroyed, it purified, yes, but it also erased. Naoki's hand trembled. He placed the paper near the flame, and the fire refused to take it. It curled slightly, but did not ignite. Again, he tried. Still, it remained whole. Confused, he returned to his master and said, "The flame would not burn the paper." The master nodded, as if already knowing. "Because tonight you saw its value," he said. "The paper did not change. You did. Fire consumes, but awareness protects. You finally saw, not with your eyes, but with your mind quiet." Naoki bowed deeply. He never burned the paper. Years later, it still rested on the altar, blank, sacred. Moral of the story. Destruction often begins in blindness, when we act without seeing. But when we pause, when we become fully aware, even the impulse to destroy fades. The simplest things carry deep meaning when we are present. And sometimes, what we don't do becomes the true teaching. The flame did not burn the paper because for the first time, the monk saw its life. The next story is called The Master Who Cried at the Bloom. In a quiet Zen monastery perched on a misty hillside, there lived an old master named Kisho. He was known for his unwavering discipline, his silence, and his gaze clear as still water. For decades, he had guided monks with sharp koans and long periods of zazen. His students believed he had passed beyond emotion, beyond attachment, beyond even the sway of life and death. But one spring, something changed. On the southern edge of the temple grounds, there stood a single cherry tree. It had been planted long ago by a monk who died before it ever bloomed. Year after year, it stood bare green with leaves in summer, brittle in winter, but never once blossoming. Most forgot about it. All except Master Kisho. Each spring he would visit the tree in the early morning. He said nothing. He only looked. Then, one year, after a long and bitter winter, the first bloom appeared. A single pink petal opening in the cold morning light. A novice saw the old master kneeling before it, unmoving. Then he noticed something even stranger. Kisho's shoulders trembled. As the novice stepped closer, he saw it clearly, tears rolling down the old master's cheeks, falling softly into the earth. The novice didn't speak. He simply waited. After a while, the master rose and said quietly, "It finally let go." He turned and walked away, the breeze carrying a few loose petals into the sky. Later that day, the novice found the courage to ask, "Master, why did the bloom bring you to tears?" Kisho looked at him and replied, "Because it waited its whole life to open, and still, it did not bloom late. It bloomed when it was ready, and I saw myself in it." From then on, the tree was never ignored, not because it was rare, but because it reminded the monks that awakening does not follow a clock or a schedule. Some bloom early, some bloom late. All are sacred. Moral of the story: there is no deadline for becoming. We each open in our own time. The world rushes us to blossom, to achieve, to arrive, but the cherry tree teaches a gentler truth, that patience is part of the path, and blooming whenever it comes is never too late. Even the master who seemed beyond feeling wept when he saw it, because some beauty waits a lifetime to reveal itself, and when it does, the heart can only bow. The next story is called The Fish Who Knew the Way. Long ago, in a coastal village wrapped in sea winds and silence, there was a temple known for its strange legend. It was said that a single koi fish lived in the temple pond for over 100 years. Monks called it Shindo, meaning the one who knows the way. But no one understood why. It was just a fish, after all. The pond itself was calm, shallow, surrounded by mossy stones and leaning pines. Every day, monks passed by it on their way to meditate, to study, to sweep the grounds. Most barely noticed the fish, except for one novice named Kaito. Kaito was filled with questions. Why are we here? What is emptiness? What is the meaning of Zen? No answer satisfied him. Teachers gave him koans, told him to sit still, to breathe, but still his mind raced. One day, while walking by the pond, frustrated and tired of silence, Kaito sat down and watched the fish. It glided slowly beneath the surface, unhurried. Its golden scales shimmered under the sunlight. Nothing special, yet something about the way it moved was different. It didn't rush. It didn't stop. It simply moved. Day after day, Kaito returned, not to think, not to solve, but just to watch. Weeks passed. Then, one morning, as mist curled across the pond, he saw the fish swimming in perfect stillness. Not against the water, not with it, but as part of it. There was no effort in its motion, no resistance, no goal. And suddenly, Kaito's mind stopped. The questions dissolved, not because they were answered, but because they no longer needed to be. The fish had shown him the way, not by teaching, not by talking, but by being. He realized, Zen isn't a path you chase, it's the current you stop fighting. Kaito bowed low beside the pond. For the first time, he was not searching. He was swimming. Moral of the story: wisdom does not always come through words. Some truths are lived so quietly, they can only be seen, not explained. When we stop chasing understanding and begin to move with life instead of against it, the path appears not ahead of us, but beneath our feet, or sometimes beneath the surface of a still pond, in the silent motion of a fish who never needed to know the way because it already was the way. The next story is called When Mountains Meditated. Long ago, in a land where clouds moved slowly and rivers carved stories into stone, a young monk named Anzu asked his master, "Do mountains ever meditate?" The question seemed foolish. Other monks chuckled. But the old master only smiled. "Come," he said, and together they climbed. For 3 days they hiked into the deep wilderness where no temple bells rang, and even the birds grew quiet. The trees thinned, the air turned thin and sharp. At last they reached a great peak, vast and unmoving, the sky resting gently on its shoulders. The master sat cross-legged on a flat rock, facing the mountain. Anzu did the same. They sat in silence. The sun rose and fell. Winds came and passed. Clouds wrapped the peak like shawls, and still the mountain did not speak. Anzu's legs ached, his thoughts scattered. "What are we waiting for?" he whispered. The master said nothing. On the 3rd day, something changed. Anzu no longer felt separate from the stone beneath him. The mountain wasn't something he was sitting on, it was something he had entered. The silence grew heavy, not with emptiness, but with presence. Each breeze, each bird call, each falling pine needle felt full, intentional, complete. Suddenly, he understood. The mountain was meditating. It wasn't trying, it wasn't striving. It didn't ask for peace or chase wisdom. It simply was vast, grounded, still. Tears filled Anzu's eyes. The master finally spoke. "You asked if mountains meditate. You were looking for movement, change, instruction. But mountains teach by being. They show us the mind that doesn't cling, the heart that doesn't hurry, the truth that doesn't shout." They began their slow descent. And from that day on, Anzu no longer sought silence in temples alone. He found it in trees, in rivers, in stones. He began to carry the mountain within him. Moral of the story: true meditation is not always done with closed eyes or folded hands. Sometimes it is learned from the stillness of things that do not speak. The mountain teaches us how to be rooted, how to wait, how to exist without grasping. When we stop asking for answers and begin to listen to the quiet weight of the world, we realize the most awakened beings do not speak at all, they endure. The next story is called The Garden That Refused to Grow. In a dry valley between 2 mountains, a Zen monk named Anzu was sent to start a new temple. There were no walls yet, only rocks and dust. But he began, day by day, to build something from the emptiness. The first thing he created was not a hall or a gate, but a garden. He cleared the soil by hand. He arranged stones with care. He planted seeds for plum trees, herbs, and wildflowers. He rose before dawn to water them, speaking softly as he worked, believing that gentleness would bring life. But weeks passed, then months. Nothing grew. The soil remained bare. The wind took the petals before they could bloom. The sun burned down hard, and still nothing. Other monks came and went, offering advice, shaking their heads, calling it cursed or hopeless. Anzu listened, bowed, and returned to tending the silent earth. One day, a young traveler saw the garden and laughed. "Why do you bother? It's dead." Anzu smiled softly. "Even dead soil listens." "But what if it never gives anything back?" the traveler asked. The monk touched the earth and said, "Then I will keep giving." That night, a soft rain came, slow, steady, patient. And in the morning, no flowers bloomed, no miracles happened. But Anzu still walked outside, barefoot, and bowed to the ground. Years passed. The garden remained quiet, not lush, not grand, just stillness, stones, and soil. But something began to shift. Moss grew in the cracks. A wild vine took root in a corner. Birds nested in the trees nearby, and eventually, not from the seeds he planted, but from the care he gave, the garden began to breathe. Not how he expected, not with color, but with peace. The garden had not grown on command, but it had become sacred. Moral of the story: not everything blooms when or how we wish. Some soil must rest, some growth is invisible. We are taught to measure success by results, but the truest gardens grow from devotion, not demand. When we give without expectation, when we love without needing return, even the barest ground holds life. The garden that refused to grow was never empty, it was becoming something slower, quieter, deeper. And so, perhaps, are we. The next story is called The One Koan Carved on a Skull. In a forgotten valley where few dared to wander, there was an abandoned cave once used by wandering ascetics. The villagers nearby spoke of it only in hushed voices. They said strange dreams came to those who passed too close. The monks at the temple avoided it, but one day, a young seeker named Nari, known for her stubborn spirit, decided to go. She carried no food, no scripture, only a desire that burned quietly in her chest, to see what truth hid beyond fear. Inside the cave, the air was damp and still. Moss clung to the walls. Bones lay in corners, remnants of lives long surrendered. But near the back of the cave, half buried in earth, she saw something unusual, a human skull, worn by time, with markings etched deep into its bone. She cleared the dust. It was not a name, not a warning, but a single line, carved with trembling hands. Who is it that dies? She stared at the words. A chill passed through her, not from cold, but from the way her thoughts unraveled in their presence. She sat beside the skull and waited, the question echoing louder than any sermon ever had. Who is it that dies? Her mind rushed to answer: the body, the ego, the self. But each answer crumbled like ash. The longer she sat, the more the cave fell silent. The question didn't want her to speak, it wanted her to see. She looked again at the skull. It had once been someone, a person, with memories, breath, dreams, and now empty, silent, gone. But the koan remained. And then something inside her loosened. She didn't find the answer. She found the space the question opened. She bowed to the skull, her heart strangely light. Years later, she returned to the monastery, no longer seeking teachings, but living as one. She never spoke of what she saw in that cave, but when asked how she found peace, she would smile and say, by learning how to truly ask. Moral of the story: some questions are not meant to be answered, they are meant to be lived. The deepest koans do not explain life, they reveal its vastness. When we face death not with fear, but with honesty, we begin to understand what it means to truly live. The skull is silent, the question remains, and in that silence, the truth waits. The next story is called The Raindrop That Answered the Question. A young monk named Nari lived in a temple perched high in the clouds, where mist curled through corridors and the silence felt like part of the walls. He was known for his sharp mind, always asking, always reading, always chasing understanding. But the more he learned, the more unsettled he became. Every answer opened a new question. Every teaching felt just out of reach. One day, he went to his master and asked the question that had haunted him for months. Master, what is the meaning of all this? Why do we meditate, chant, sweep, breathe, repeat? What are we moving toward? The master said nothing. Instead, he handed Nari a wide, empty bowl and told him to sit in the courtyard. Wait for the answer, the master said. The sky was grey, the air still. Nari sat in the courtyard, bowl in lap, eyes searching the sky. Hours passed. Wind moved, nothing came. He shifted, sighed, doubted. Am I just waiting for nothing? But still, he sat. By late afternoon, a single drop of rain fell from the sky. Plink! It landed in the center of the bowl, soft and small. That was all. But in that one sound, in that one ripple spreading outward, something inside Nari fell silent. He looked into the bowl, not at the drop, but at the space it had touched, the stillness after, the way everything, just for a second, paused. And he suddenly understood. It wasn't about getting the answer. It was about becoming quiet enough to hear it. He returned to the master and bowed deeply. I received the teaching. The master smiled. What did the raindrop say? Nari replied, nothing, but it told me everything. Moral of the story. The answers we chase often hide in the spaces we overlook, in silence, in waiting, in a single drop of rain. Wisdom does not always come with words. Sometimes it comes when we stop searching, stop speaking, and simply listen. One raindrop, fully received, can be more illuminating than 1,000 teachings. But only when the bowl is empty and the heart is still. The next story is called The Smiling Corpse. In a small village bordered by fields and fog, there was a legend passed down through whispers of a corpse found long ago in the forest, sitting upright, untouched by decay, with a faint, unmistakable smile on its face. Many said it was a tale for children, a warning, or a ghost story. But the old monks at the mountain temple knew better. They said the corpse had once been a Zen hermit named Shoma. Shoma had left the monastery many decades earlier, without explanation. He took nothing but a robe, a begging bowl, and his breath. No one knew where he went, only that he sought silence deeper than words, stillness deeper than form. He disappeared into the forest, and for years nothing was heard. Until one autumn day, a hunter wandered through a hidden grove and found him seated beneath a gnarled pine, legs folded in perfect zazen, hands resting gently in his lap, spine straight as a blade. He was long dead, yet his body had not fallen, his skin had not turned, and on his lips the faintest smile. Startled, the hunter called the monks, who came quickly. They did not weep, they did not chant, they simply sat in silence before him. One monk finally whispered, "He died, sitting." Another replied, "No, he lived, dying." Years later, that grove became a sacred place. Not because of miracles, not because of magic, but because of what that still figure said without speaking. Even in death, Shoma had revealed the essence of the path, not to escape death, but to meet it without fear, not to delay awakening, but to carry it all the way to the final breath. His smile wasn't defiance, it was acceptance. It was the peace of someone who had let go so completely, even death could not take anything from him. Moral of the story: enlightenment is not about escaping mortality, it is about meeting it fully, without clinging, without resistance. When we stop running from death, we begin to live with honesty, with depth, with presence. The smiling corpse did not teach with breath or speech. His stillness said everything. Nothing is permanent, and nothing needs to be feared. The next story is called The Scroll That Was Blank. In a remote mountain monastery where clouds rolled like waves over the cliffs, there lived a respected calligraphy master named Shomei. He was old, quiet, and rarely seen, but his scrolls were revered across the land. Each one was said to carry not just words, but silence between the words. Students traveled far to see his work poems about impermanence, inked in strokes that felt like wind and water. One spring, a young monk named Rei was chosen to assist Shomei during his final years. Rei was eager, proud, and filled with ambition. "Master," he said one morning, "before you leave this world, I want to see your final teaching. One last scroll, your greatest." Shomei said nothing. He simply nodded and motioned for Ray to bring paper, brush, and ink. Days passed. The door to the calligraphy room stayed closed. Ray waited outside, imagining what deep, final wisdom the scroll would reveal. At last, Shomei emerged. He handed Ray the scroll, carefully rolled and tied with a silk cord. His hands trembled with age, but his eyes were clear. "This," he said, "is my last teaching." Ray rushed to unroll it, heart pounding. But when the scroll opened, there was nothing. No brushstroke, no poem, no ink. Just empty, white space. "Master," Ray said, confused and hurt, "there's nothing here." Shomei looked at him gently and replied, "No, my son, there is everything here." Ray stared at the blank page. His pride flared. "But you've written nothing." Shomei stepped closer, placed a hand over Ray's chest, and said softly, "Then perhaps it is time for you to begin writing." Only then did Ray realize every teaching he had ever read was written by another hand. Every truth he had clung to belonged to someone else. He had never dared to live his own, never faced the vast silence of the unwritten. The scroll was not a conclusion. It was a mirror. Moral of the story: the deepest teachings do not always come filled with words. Sometimes they arrive empty so that we may finally see what we are carrying within. The blank scroll reminds us, true understanding is not inherited. It must be lived. When we stop looking for answers in someone else's script, we begin to write the truth of our own awakening, not with ink, but with presence. The next story is called The Monk Who Tied His Mind to a Rope. In a monastery nestled between cliffs and clouds, there lived a monk named Rio, who was known for his fierce discipline, but also his restless mind. No matter how long he sat in meditation, thoughts flooded him like a storm. Memories, plans, fears, regrets. His mind clung to everything. "Why can't I be still?" he once asked his teacher. "I sit for hours, but my mind leaps like a monkey in a cage." The teacher looked at him for a long moment and replied, "Then tie the monkey." Rio was confused. "Tie it?" The teacher said nothing more. That night, unable to sleep, Rio walked outside under the moonlight, pacing the stone path behind the zendo. His thoughts swirled again, louder than ever. Suddenly, in a quiet act of desperation or faith, he returned to his room, took a length of rope used for drawing water, and sat. He tied one end around his wrist, and the other around the leg of his meditation bench. "I will sit," he whispered, "and if my mind wants to run, let it feel the pull." He closed his eyes and breathed. At first, nothing changed. Thoughts raced, plans pulled, fears bit. But each time he reached to follow them physically, mentally he felt the gentle tug of the rope. A reminder, a return. The rope didn't hold his body. It reminded him to hold his attention. Night after night, he practiced this way. The rope became not a restraint, but a guide, a way back, a silent bell. Years passed. One morning, a new student entered the hall and noticed an old frayed rope tied to a hook in the floor beside Rio's mat. "Master," the student asked, "what is that for?" Rio smiled and replied, "It was for my mind, until it learned to sit." Moral of the story: the mind is wild, always moving, reaching for past, for future, for escape. Discipline is not about punishment. It is about returning, again and again. We all need something, a breath, a bell, a ropito bring us back. The monk didn't fight his thoughts. He simply learned how to stay. And in staying, the mind stopped running, not because it was forced, but because it was no longer afraid. The next story is called The Silence of the Last Cicada. In the late summer months, when the air hung heavy with heat and the trees echoed with the cry of thousands of cicadas, a Zen monk named Kiko lived alone in a forest hermitage. Every morning, he sat beneath the old maple tree and meditated to the rhythm of their calls, constant, piercing, wild. It was a sound that seemed to hold the pulse of life itself. But Kiko was growing old. His knees ached, his breath came slower, and lately he had begun to wonder, when will my silence come? One morning, as the leaves began to dry at the edges and the song of the cicadas grew fainter, Kiko heard something different. Not sound, but the absence of it. He opened his eyes and realized only one cicada remained. All others had fallen silent. The forest now held a strange stillness, like a held breath. The last cicada sang alone. Its voice was thinner, now less urgent, less wild. It did not cry for mating or survival. It simply sang, as if offering its final breath back to the forest that had held it. Kiko sat perfectly still, his hands resting in his lap, and as the final notes echoed and then faded, something opened inside him. It was not sadness, not fear. It was peace. He realized all life is a season. Every voice, no matter how loud or constant, will one day end in silence. But that silence is not the end. It is the return. That day, Kiko swept the garden without a single word. He boiled tea slowly, savoring each moment. And when evening came, he sat again beneath the maple and listened not for sound, but for the quiet that had finally arrived. There was no sorrow in the stillness, only depth, only home. Moral of the story: the world teaches not only through noise, but through its ending. We spend so much of life listening to the loudness, rushing, craving, clinging, but the truest lessons often arrive when all sound fades. The silence of the last cicada is not emptiness, it is the space where all things return. When we stop fearing the quiet, we begin to hear life more clearly than ever before. The next story is called The Woman Who Bowed to Her Own Shadow. In a quiet village near the sea, there lived a woman named Nami who worked as a potter. Her hands were skilled, her kiln always warm, her shelves filled with bowls shaped by years of silence and solitude. She lived alone, rarely spoke, and seemed to carry something heavy inside her that no one could name. As a child, Nami had been told she was too sensitive, too quiet, too strange. She had learned to hide her feelings, her fears, her thoughts. Over time, she even began to hide from herself. She poured her soul into clay, but never into her own heart. One day, during a rare visit to the village temple, she overheard a monk say, "The path to awakening begins the moment you stop running from what follows you." That night, as the sun fell and the light faded, Nami noticed her shadow stretching across the walls of her small home. It moved. As she moved, mirrored her every step, every gesture. But something was different. She didn't look away. Instead, she sat quietly and watched it. For hours. She remembered every part of herself she had, buried grief, shame, mistakes, desires, fear. They were all there, hidden in that long, soft shadow. And for the first time in her life, she bowed to it. She didn't know why. She simply placed her palms together, lowered her head, and honored it not with fear, not with blame, but with acceptance. A warmth rose in her chest. In the stillness of that bow, something broke open, not into pain, but into peace. The kind that comes not from light, but from no longer fearing the dark. From that day on, her pottery changed. Her bowls held something more than form. People said they felt alive. When asked what had shifted, Nami would smile gently and say, "I stopped hiding from what was already mine." Moral of the story: we all cast shadows, the parts of us we fear, reject, or try to escape. But the path to wholeness is not found by running from them. It begins when we turn around, face what follows us, and bow. Not to worship our pain, but to welcome it. When we honor every part of who we are, even the broken pieces shine with quiet grace. The next story is called The Rice Bowl That Never Emptied. In a quiet mountain village where mist clung to the rooftops and time moved slowly, there lived an old nun named Amaya. She was known for her laughter, her soft eyes, and her humble clay bowl. Every day, she would sit by the roadside and offer rice to anyone who passed: farmers, children, monks, beggars. No one was ever turned away. Her bowl was nothing special, chipped at the edges, dull in color. Yet no matter how many scoops she gave, the bowl never seemed to run out. Morning to dusk, hand after hand, still the rice came. One day, a skeptical merchant stopped at her roadside spot. He had heard the rumors and came to see for himself. "Old woman," he said, "do you perform magic?" Amaya smiled and shook her head. "Only kindness." He watched her serve a dozen villagers. Still, the rice remained. "What's your secret?" he demanded. "Where do you hide the rest?" Amaya looked into the bowl. "I've had this bowl since I was a novice. Back then it seemed to hold very little. But as I gave more, it gave more. I began to see emptiness is not the absence of things. It is the space from which giving becomes endless." The merchant scoffed. "That makes no sense." She smiled gently. "That's because you think the bowl holds the rice. But it's the giving that fills it." That night, as the village grew quiet, a young orphan approached Amaya. He didn't ask for food, he only sat beside her, eyes downcast, hands empty. Amaya placed the bowl between them and said, "Here, you hold it now." The boy hesitated, then reached in. And though the bowl had been used all day, he pulled out a full scoop, warm, fragrant, enough to satisfy. Tears welled in his eyes. Not because of the rice, but because, for the first time, he had been trusted to give. Moral of the story: what we offer to others does not deplete, use it, completes us. True abundance does not come from storing or hoarding, but from an open heart that never stops giving. Like a bowl that never empties, the more we share, the more we discover. Generosity is not a sacrifice, it is a wellspring, and the hand that gives is always the one that receives. The next story is called The Two Monks Who Dreamed of Each Other. In two monasteries separated by a mountain range lived two monks who had never met. One was an old master named Hakujo, known for his wisdom and stillness. The other, young and full of doubt, was named Renji, a novice, just beginning his path, often plagued by questions he couldn't silence. One night, as the moon rose over the quiet slopes, Renji fell into a deep and vivid dream. In it, he stood in a vast hall of stone and mist. A figure appeared calm, cloaked in grey robes, his face marked with time but gentle as spring rain. The figure said only one thing: "You are not alone in your searching." Renji woke with tears on his cheeks. The next night, across the mountains, Hakujo too dreamed. He was walking through a forest when a young monk appeared beside him, looking lost, eyes wide and heavy with questions. Without speaking, Hakujo reached out and placed a hand on the young man's shoulder. The boy smiled and vanished. In the morning, Hakujo rose from his mat and told no one. He simply walked to the river and bowed. Weeks passed. One day, by rare chance, Renji's monastery sent him to deliver offerings to Hakujo's temple across the mountains. When he arrived, weary from travel, he stepped into the courtyard and froze. There stood Hakujo, raking the gravel garden, exactly as he had appeared in Renji's dream. Hakujo looked up, then paused, his eyes softening. "You've arrived," he said, as if greeting an old friend. Renji fell to his knees, overwhelmed. "Master," he whispered, "I don't understand." "You don't need to," Hakujo replied. "The Dharma travels faster than our feet." They sat together for hours without speaking of dreams, without asking questions, just sitting, just breathing. Each knew without doubt they had met before, not in time, not in place, but in something deeper than both. Moral of the story: there are connections that defy logic, and truths that reach us when words cannot. Sometimes the heart calls across mountains and is heard in silence. When we open ourselves fully, even dreams become part of the path. The Dharma is not bound by distance. It moves in stillness, appears in dreams, and reminds us we are never truly alone in our seeking. In a world that moves too fast and asks too much, stillness becomes a rare and sacred thing. Through these Zen stories and Buddhist teachings, we've wandered mountain paths, listened to rain, watched leaves fall, and even shared silence with stone. From a monk hiding in a tree to a scroll left blank, from the song of a cicada to the wisdom in a rice bowl, each story reminds us of something simple and true. Peace is not found by escaping life, but by being fully present in it. Sometimes the most powerful awakening comes not in a thunderclap, but in a single breath. Which story spoke to your heart today? Was it the pebble in Buddha's bowl, or the garden that refused to grow? Leave a comment below and share the moment that stirred something in you. Someone else may need to hear it too. And if this journey brought you even a little closer to calm, insight, or a softer way of being, subscribe for more quiet wisdom in a noisy world. Your path toward peace continues here. See you in the next story. Until then, breathe gently and walk with presence.